Oh, stumbling upon this quiet refuge is no accident. Perhaps the Force guided your steps here. Follow me, sit beside the fire, and take some rest. There's a long road ahead of you among the stars, so feel free to ease your mind and listen to my tales. Tonight, we travel far back, nearly 4,000 years before the age of empires and rebellions you may know, to a time when the Old Republic still stood, and the Jedi Order struggled to keep the peace. This is the story of a man who was hero and villain, savior and conqueror, the prodigal knight and the Dark Lord both, a soul torn between light and shadow. His name is Revan. Our story begins around the year 3994, before the Battle of Yavin, in the distant reaches of the Outer Rim territories. Somewhere, out among those scattered worlds, a child was born, and that child was orphaned young. No records survive of his parents, and even Revan himself would never learn who they truly were. The Jedi Order found him while he was still small, sensed the Force flowing strong within him, and took him into their care. From that moment onward, the Order became the only family he would ever know, and its ancient halls became the only home he could remember. In those days, the Galactic Republic stretched across countless star systems, binding worlds together through trade routes, treaties, and shared law. The Jedi served as the guardians of that peace, keepers of an old and disciplined tradition. They trained from childhood to sense the Force, to wield it with restraint, and to place the needs of the many above the desires of the self. Younglings were gathered into the Order, taught by masters, and slowly shaped into knights who would carry the Jedi code across the galaxy. Into this world of quiet temples and stern teachers, the orphaned boy grew up, absorbing every lesson placed before him. The child was apprenticed to a Jedi master named Kreia, a woman of sharp intellect and unconventional views. Under her guidance, the young apprentice flourished, and his mind proved to be a rare and remarkable instrument. He asked questions that other students never thought to ask, chased ideas down paths that his teachers hesitated to follow, and consumed knowledge with a hunger that seemed impossible to satisfy. Where other students were content to memorize the teachings handed down to them, this one wanted to understand why those teachings existed at all, and whether they were truly right. His gifts extended far beyond the library and the meditation chamber. He carried himself with an ease that drew people toward him, and his words had a way of stirring conviction in those who listened. Fellow students gathered around him, older knights took notice of him, and even the masters spoke of his promise in hushed and hopeful tones. He blended a brilliant mind with a warmth of personality, and the combination marked him as someone destined for great things. Among an entire generation of Jedi, he stood out as one of the brightest the Order had produced in many years. Yet that very brilliance carried a shadow within it. His curiosity refused to respect the boundaries the Order had drawn, and he questioned traditions that the masters preferred to leave unquestioned. He studied subjects that made his teachers uneasy, and he probed the edges of Jedi doctrine where most students dared not look. Kreia recognized this restlessness in him, and while she nurtured his mind, she also understood how dangerous such hunger could become. Some among the Order admired his boldness, while others watched him with a growing sense of worry, wondering where all that questioning might one day lead. He absorbed the ways of the lightsaber, the discipline of Force meditation, and the vast history of the galaxy with equal appetite. He earned the respect of his peers through both his skill and his kindness, and he seemed, in those early years, to embody everything the Jedi hoped a young knight could be. Nobody watching him train in the temple courtyards could have imagined the roads he would eventually walk. He was a promising student, a loyal friend, and a devoted servant of the light. The darkness that would one day claim him lay far ahead, hidden beyond the horizon of a future no one could yet see. Through all of these formative years, the young apprentice was never entirely alone in his ambitions. He found a companion whose loyalty would shape the course of his entire life, a fellow student who trained beside him and shared in his restless dreams. Together, the two of them would rise through the ranks of the Order, and together they would one day stand at the very heart of a galaxy at war. To understand the man Revan became, one must first understand the friend who walked beside him and the bond that would eventually shatter into betrayal. A tall, broad-shouldered Padawan named Alec matched the young apprentice step for step through the stone corridors of the Jedi Temple. Alec stood an entire head taller than his peers, possessing pale skin, a thick jawline, and heavy, muscular arms that easily carried the weight of a training saber. The two students spent their days sparring on the polished marble floors of the training rings. During these sessions, the physical differences between them became obvious. Alec delivered heavy, two-handed downward strikes, driving his boots firmly into the ground and pushing forward with raw physical mass. His companion met these heavy blows by pivoting on the balls of his feet, redirecting the momentum and stepping into the blind spots of Alec's guard. The young apprentice calculated the exact angle of every swing, exploiting small gaps in Alec's defense and tapping his shoulder or ribs with the training blade. Through these daily matches, the young Jedi demonstrated a meticulous grasp of spatial awareness, timing, and positioning, utilizing body mechanics and spatial geometry to outmaneuver a much larger opponent. The two friends advanced through the ranks of the Jedi Order side by side. They spent hours sitting cross-legged on the woven mats of the meditation chambers, regulating their breathing and lifting small stone spheres into the air through physical focus alone. They studied the ancient star charts projected in blue light across the archives, tracing the hyperspace lanes that connected the core worlds to the outer rim. When the time came to construct their own weapons, the young apprentice built a lightsaber that projected a brilliant blue blade. The humming blue plasma illuminated his features, casting sharp reflections across his eyes and highlighting the coarse brown weave of his traditional Jedi robes. He stood before the Jedi Council in the high tower of the temple, a stalwart Jedi Knight recognized for his skill, his intellect, and his dedication to the light side of the Force. Alec stood beside him, receiving the exact same honor, standing shoulder to shoulder with his closest companion as they accepted the responsibilities of their new rank. As a newly appointed Jedi Knight, the young man continued to study fleet formations, ground infantry tactics, and planetary supply logistics. He spent his evenings reviewing holographic recordings of historical battles, analyzing troop movements, and identifying the structural vulnerabilities in orbital defense platforms. Fellow knights gathered around his terminal in the archives, watching him rearrange holographic dreadnoughts and fighter squadrons into flawless defensive screens. He spoke with a clear, steady voice, pointing out the exact choke points in the hyperspace routes and explaining how a smaller fleet could flank a larger armada by utilizing the gravitational pull of nearby moons. His peers listened closely, absorbing his strategic insights, while Alec always stood right behind his shoulder, crossing his massive arms and nodding in agreement. The young knight soon began projecting his voice in the open courtyards and the grand hallways of the temple. He gathered groups of young Jedi around the central fountains, displaying holographic news feeds from the outer rim. He pointed at the casualty reports scrolling in red text across the displays. He detailed the destruction of civilian settlements, describing the cratered cities, the scorched agricultural fields, and the long lines of refugees crowding into transport ships. The Jedi Council remained seated in their high tower, instructing the knights to meditate on the will of the Force and observe the conflict from a distance. The young knight spoke against this stance openly. He stood on the stone steps of the temple, his blue lightsaber clipped to his belt, and called for the Jedi Order to take up arms. He argued that meditating in the temple while the border planets burned equated to abandoning the citizens of the Republic. Alec echoed every word his friend spoke, adding his loud, booming voice to the growing crowds. Together, they paced through the temple gardens, debating the older masters and challenging the orthodox teachings of the council. The young knight held the gaze of his listeners, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the courtyard, and offered clear, actionable plans to defend the Republic. Young Padawans and seasoned knights alike flocked to his side, drawn by his firm, unwavering tone and his detailed tactical plans. He stood at the center of these gatherings, assembling a large group of like-minded Jedi, willing to pack their gear and leave the safety of the temple. The holographic maps in the archives began flashing, with new distress signals from the edge of Republic space. Red markers multiplied across the display screens, highlighting star systems falling one by one to an invading force. Com chatter recorded the sounds of heavy blaster fire, the roaring engines of descending dropships, and the screams of planetary defense forces. A highly organized, heavily armored culture had crossed the border, deploying massive basilisk war droids and initiating a campaign of total planetary conquest. The invaders arrived on the edge of Republic space, clad in heavy iron armor. These warriors called themselves Mandalorians, and they organized their entire society around physical combat and territorial expansion. They forged their chest plates and helmets from thick metals, painting the surfaces with clan colors of red, gold, and blue. Each helmet featured a distinct T-shaped visor, obscuring their faces behind dark glass. They spent their lives firing blaster rifles, swinging vibroblades, and training in hand-to-hand combat across the harsh terrain of their home worlds. To them, strength dictated the right to rule, and they sought to prove their strength by expanding their borders into neighboring star systems. Around the year 3978, before the Battle of Yavin, the Mandalorian clans mobilized their massive fleets and crossed the boundary into Republic space. Silver warships dropped out of hyperspace above outer rim planets, darkening the skies and blocking out the suns. The engines of the warships emitted a low, vibrating hum that shook the glass windows of planetary defense towers. Their troop transports descended through the atmosphere, deploying heavy basilisk war droids. These mechanized beasts crashed into the planetary crust, tearing up permacrete roads with heavy metallic claws and firing laser cannons into civilian structures. Mandalorian foot soldiers poured out of the landing craft, discharging continuous streams of red blaster bolts into the local defense forces. The invasion struck the agricultural and industrial worlds of the Outer Rim with devastating force. Orbital bombardments flattened entire cities, turning towering skyscrapers into piles of smoking rubble and twisted durasteel. Fires burned through the dense forests and crop fields, filling the air with the smell of burning wood and ozone. Republic citizens fled their homes, carrying whatever belongings they could fit into small satchels. Thousands of refugees crowded onto spaceports, pushing their way up the metal ramps of escaping transport ships. Republic soldiers carried the injured on stretchers, leaving trails of red across the landing pads. Medical droids moved through the chaotic camps, wrapping bandages around blaster burns and injecting stims into the arms of the wounded. The groans of injured soldiers and the crying of orphaned children echoed across the docking bays. Information regarding the attacks quickly reached the core worlds. Inside the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the Masters of the Jedi Council sat in their high-backed chairs, forming a wide circle. The blue light of the holoprojectors illuminated the center of the room, displaying detailed casualty reports, planetary blockades, and burning settlements. The Jedi Masters watched the scrolling text and the images of destruction. They placed their hands on their laps, closed their eyes, and regulated their breathing. They instructed the knights and Padawans to maintain their daily routines of meditation and lightsaber practice. The council members spoke in measured tones, advising patience and caution. They instructed the members of the Order to stay within the stone walls of the temple and wait for a clearer vision from the Force. The physical contrast between the war zone and the Jedi Temple grew sharper with every passing week. On the front lines, Republic soldiers waded through thick mud, firing their rifles from water-filled trenches while Mandalorian artillery shells exploded overhead. The air smelled of sulfur and spilled blood. Back on Coruscant, the temple gardens remained quiet and pristine, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and flowing water from the decorative fountains. The Jedi Masters continued their quiet discussions in the High Tower, reviewing the distress calls and choosing to observe the conflict from a distance. They kept their lightsabers clipped to their belts, choosing diplomacy and passive observation over physical intervention. Down in the temple archives, the young knight and his companion Alec watched the same holographic distress signals. The young knight gripped the edges of the holotable, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the red markers consuming the map of the Outer Rim. He listened to the recorded screams of the planetary governors begging for military support. He looked at the casualty numbers ticking upward in a steady, relentless rhythm. He felt the smooth metal cylinder of his lightsaber hanging at his waist, and he felt the thick fabric of his Jedi robes covering his shoulders. He turned away from the holotable and stepped out into the main corridors of the temple. Alec followed closely behind him, his heavy boots echoing on the polished stone floor. The young knight gathered his belongings, strapping a utility belt over his tunic and packing a small satchel with survival gear. He walked directly into the central courtyard, standing on the elevated stone platform where the younglings usually practiced their forms. He raised his voice, projecting his words across the open space, and called for the Jedi to leave the temple. He asked them to look at the burning worlds, to listen to the cries of the refugees, and to carry their lightsabers to the front lines. He pointed toward the hangar bays, offering a clear path out of the quiet temple and into the mud and smoke of the Mandalorian wars. He stepped down from the platform, walking toward the transport ships, expecting others to follow his lead into the heart of the conflict. The young knight strode down the wide stone steps of the Jedi Temple, gripping the strap of a heavy leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Several dozen Jedi followed closely behind his heels, their leather boots striking the polished marble stairs in a steady, unified rhythm. Alec walked right beside him, carrying a large canvas duffel bag packed with survival rations and field medical kits. They passed the tall bronze statues of ancient Jedi Masters, walking out of the grand archways and onto the permacrete landing pads of Coruscant. The members of the Jedi High Council remained in their circular chamber at the top of the central tower, sitting on their cushioned seats with their eyes closed in silent meditation. The The departing Jedi marched across the landing platform and boarded the waiting Republic transport shuttles. The heavy metal ramps retracted, the repulsor lift engines ignited with a loud, vibrating hum, and the ships lifted into the traffic lanes of the capital world. Inside the steel walls of a Republic staging facility, the knight stood before a gathering of planetary governors, fleet admirals, and infantry commanders. He placed his hands flat on the edges of the central holotable and looked at the men and women wearing the olive-green uniforms of the Republic military. He announced that he would lead their forces against the Mandalorian invaders, and he claimed a new title for himself. He dropped his birth name and declared that the galaxy would now know him as Revan. The Jedi who had followed him from the temple adopted this title for their own cause, referring to themselves as the Revanchists. The Republic officers stood at attention, saluting their new leader, and handed him datapads loaded with fleet manifests and planetary defense grids. Revan accepted the datapads, swiping through the tactical data and immediately issuing deployment orders to the fleet admirals. The Revanchists quickly adapted to the physical realities of the war zone. They modified their traditional attire, strapping plastoid chest plates and durasteel braces over their woven cotton tunics. Alec fastened heavy, oversized pauldrons to his broad shoulders, painting them with the dark red insignia of the Republic military. The young Jedi clipped fragmentation grenades and spare power packs to their utility belts right next to their lightsabers. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Republic infantry troopers in the hangar bays, loading heavy blaster rifles into the weapon racks of the descending dropships. The visual distinction between the peacekeepers of the Jedi Order and the soldiers of the Republic military vanished, replaced by the uniform appearance of an organized, armed resistance preparing for a brutal planetary assault. The Republic Senate officially granted Revan the rank of Supreme Commander, placing the entirety of their military forces under his direct control. He spent his days pacing the length of the tactical bridges on Republic dreadnoughts, wearing the metal rank cylinders across the chest of his armor. He pointed his gloved fingers at the glowing blue topography lines of the holographic maps, issuing precise coordinates to the orbital artillery units. He directed fighter squadrons through asteroid fields, flanking the heavy Mandalorian cruisers and targeting their exposed engine banks with proton torpedoes. Down on the surface of the contested worlds, Revan led the ground charges himself. He ignited his blue lightsaber and sprinted across the mud-filled trenches, deflecting incoming red blaster bolts back into the T-shaped visors of the Mandalorian shock troopers. Republic soldiers rallied behind the hum of his plasma blade, pushing forward with renewed aggression and firing their rifles over the heavy dirt embankments. The physical distance between Revan and the Jedi Council mirrored the deep philosophical divide separating their actions. The Council Masters sat on woven mats in the quiet, temperature-controlled meditation rooms of the Coruscant Temple, breathing in the scent of burning incense and listening to the gentle flow of the decorative water fountains. Conversely, Revan and his followers stood knee-deep in swamp water on the border worlds, breathing air thick with grey smoke, sulfur, and the metallic smell of spilled blood. The Revanchists swung their lightsabers through thick Mandalorian armor plates, leaving deep, glowing scorch marks across the iron chest pieces of their enemies. They matched the brutal tactics of the invaders with their own calculated, aggressive strikes, driving the Mandalorian forces out of the occupied cities block by block. The Republic fleets pursued the retreating Mandalorian cruisers from one star system to the next, clearing the hyperspace lanes and reclaiming the stolen territories. Revan stood at the main viewport of his flagship, watching the stars stretch into long white lines as the fleet jumped into a new sector. The ship dropped out of lightspeed, revealing a dark, scorched planet hanging in the void of space. The orbital scanners displayed massive thermal craters across the continents, indicating recent, heavy bombardments. Revan ordered the fleet to hold their positions in orbit and walked toward the hangar bay to board a surface transport. The shuttle descended through a thick layer of black ash hanging in the atmosphere, its landing gear touching down on the charred, lifeless dirt of the planet Cathar. The heavy metal ramp of the Republic transport shuttle lowered with a mechanical whine, crushing the brittle, blackened topsoil of the planet Cathar. Revan stepped down from the ramp, his brown leather boots sinking into a thick layer of grey ash. Alec walked right behind him, carrying his lightsaber clipped to his belt. Republic soldiers fanned out across the landing zone, holding their blaster rifles across their chests and scanning the horizon. The landscape consisted entirely of vitrified sand, melted rocks, and the carbonized stumps of massive trees. The heavy laser cannons of the Mandalorian fleets had bombarded the planet, burning the forests and evaporating the moisture from the soil. The air smelled of sulfur, burning carbon, and scorched bone. Revan led the group over a ridge of fused glass and stopped at the edge of a vast, dry basin. The basin stretched for miles in every direction, filled with the skeletal remains of the feline Cathar species. Feline skulls with pronounced canine teeth lay scattered across the cracked mud. Rib cages and femurs formed massive, tangled piles along the former shoreline. The Mandalorian forces, commanded by Cassus Fett, had driven the entire planetary population into the ocean waters. Once the Cathar stood trapped in the surf, Cassus Fett ordered his gunships to fire directly into the sea. The sustained orbital bombardment boiled the oceans away, reducing the water to steam and incinerating the bodies of the inhabitants. Millions of calcified skeletons now rested in the dry seabed, covered by a thin blanket of descending grey soot. Republic medics walked slowly through the remains, carrying portable scanners and recording the vast numbers of the dead. Revan moved away from the main group, walking alone along the elevated ridge. He followed a distinct pull in the Force, letting his senses guide his footsteps toward a cluster of shattered boulders. Half buried in the loose ash, a piece of curved metal reflected the dull light of the sun. Revan knelt in the dirt and brushed the soot away with his gloved hands. He pulled a Mandalorian helmet from the ground. The faceplate featured a narrow, T-shaped visor, surrounded by sleek, angular cheek guards. Heavy scorch marks covered the crown of the helmet, and the metal felt cold against his skin. Revan placed his bare fingertips directly onto the scorched steel of the faceplate. The physical contact triggered an immediate reaction in the Force. The grey ash covering the ground vanished from Revan's visual field, replaced by the bright blue sky and rolling oceans of the past. A highly detailed Force vision overtook his senses. The dry basin filled with crashing waves. Thousands of living Cathar stood waist-deep in the water, their fur soaked and their hands raised above their heads. On the ridge directly above the ocean, the Mandalorian commander Cassus Fett stood surrounded by heavily armed infantry and towering basilisk war droids. Cassus Fett wore bright gold and black armor, and he held his right gauntlet elevated in the air, signaling the gunners to target the gathered civilians. As the droids powered up their heavy laser cannons, a single Mandalorian warrior broke formation. She wore the exact helmet Revan now held in his hands. She sprinted down the ridge, stepping directly between the heavy cannons and the Cathar in the water. She unslung her blaster rifle from her shoulder and threw it into the mud. She spread her arms wide, exposing her chest to her own commander. She shouted through her helmet's vocabulator, pointing at the people in the water, and then striking her own chest plate with her fist. Casus Fett dropped his right arm. The heavy cannons on the war droids discharged simultaneously. Thick beams of concentrated thermal energy struck the female warrior directly in the chest. The intense heat melted her armor and vaporized her body in a fraction of a second. The laser fire continued on its trajectory, striking the ocean and the Cathar civilians. The water flashed into boiling steam, and the blinding light of the explosion forced Revan to squeeze his eyes shut. The thermal flash subsided, returning Revan's sight to the present moment. He knelt in the grey ash, gripping the scorched metal mask with both hands. His chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. Alec stepped up behind him, his boots crunching loudly on the dry ground. Several other Jedi Knights gathered around the ridge, looking at the metal object in Revan's hands. Revan stood up, turning the mask over to inspect the internal padding and the atmospheric seals. He raised the metal plate to his face. He aligned the T-shaped visor with his own eyes and pressed the edges firmly against his jaw. The pressure seals locked into place with a sharp, mechanical click. The dark glass completely concealed his facial features. Revan turned to face Alec and the surrounding Jedi. His voice vibrated through the internal vocabulator of the helmet, taking on a deep, metallic resonance. He pointed down at the massive basin filled with the Cathar skeletons. He stated his intentions to the gathered crowd, declaring he would wear the mask of the fallen Mandalorian woman at all times. He promised to keep the metal plate locked over his face until he broke the Mandalorian armies and drove them entirely out of Republic space. He vowed to hunt down Casus Fett and every other commander responsible for the executions, ensuring they faced direct consequences for their actions. The masked figure adjusted his heavy brown robes and turned away from the mass grave. He walked back toward the Republic shuttle, his pace fast and his strides long and purposeful. Alec and the revanchists followed him up the metal ramp, stepping into the troop compartment. The pilot ignited the repulsor lift engines, and the ship lifted off the scorched earth, carrying a commander who had fully embraced the necessity of absolute warfare. He set his sights on the Republic fleets waiting in orbit, preparing to take direct control of the entire military apparatus and escalate the counteroffensive to match the brutality of the invaders. Revan stood at the center of the Republic flagship's command deck, wearing the scorched Mandalorian mask over his face. The dark, T-shaped visor completely obscured his eyes, reflecting the glowing blue tactical maps projected from the central holotable. His voice echoed through the internal vocabulator, issuing rapid, precise coordinates to the fleet admirals. Beside him stood his closest companion, who had now taken the name Malak. Malak wore heavy durasteel armor, his broad shoulders casting long shadows across the metal floor of the bridge. The Republic officers and the gathered Jedi Knights stopped addressing Revan by his former titles, referring to him only as the Supreme Commander. They looked at the metal plate covering his features and followed his deployment orders without hesitation. The mask served as a constant visual focal point for the Republic troops, replacing the face of a Jedi peacekeeper with the immovable visage of a military tactician. The Republic Armada pushed outward into the contested sectors of the Outer Rim. Revan directed the fleet movements with mathematical precision, exploiting the rigid combat formations of the Mandalorian warships. He ordered Republic cruisers to hide their thermal signatures within the dense gas clouds of nebulae, waiting for the heavy Mandalorian dreadnoughts to pass by. Once the enemy engines cleared the gas clouds, Revan signaled the attack. Republic gunships emerged from the cover of the nebulae, firing concentrated barrages of proton torpedoes directly into the exposed thruster banks of the Mandalorian vessels. The enemy ships ruptured, venting oxygen and debris into the vacuum of space. Revan watched the explosions through the thick glass steel viewports of his flagship, his posture straight and his hands clasped behind his back. As the scale of the counter-offensive expanded, Revan divided the Republic forces into specialized task forces and appointed key generals to command them. Among these commanders stood a young Jedi named Meetra Surik. She wore a simple beige tunic, layered under heavy plastoid chest armor, her lightsaber resting against her hip. She stood opposite Revan at the holotable, her fingers dancing across the glowing console as she mapped out ground assault trajectories. Meetra coordinated the deployment of infantry battalions and heavy walker units, establishing secure beachheads on occupied planets. Revan observed her tactical adjustments, recognizing her ability to read the terrain and outmaneuver the entrenched Mandalorian defenders. He placed entire planetary campaigns under her direct command, allowing her to lead the frontline charges while he managed the broader movement of the fleet. The physical environment of the command deck slowly altered as the campaign dragged through its second year. The bright lighting of the flagship dimmed, replaced by the harsh, red emergency illumination of active combat zones. The smell of recycled air mixed with the scent of ozone, burnt wiring, and chaff. Revan spent consecutive days standing over the holotable, his brown robes stained with engine grease and his metal mask reflecting the endless streams of casualty reports. His physical demeanor shifted. He stopped pacing the deck and instead stood perfectly still, his eyes hidden behind the dark glass. He read the scrolling lists of destroyed Republic ships and dead infantrymen, his gloved hands remaining firmly clasped behind his back. His orders reflected a new, highly calculated approach to warfare. When a Republic supply outpost broadcasted a distress signal under heavy Mandalorian bombardment, Revan evaluated the strategic value of the sector. He calculated the fuel costs and the transit time required to mount a rescue. He reached out with his gloved hand and pressed the command key to terminate the incoming transmission, leaving the outpost to fall. He redirected the reinforcement fleets to flank the Mandalorian supply lines instead. Meetra Surik watched his hand press the console, her eyes dropping to the blinking red lights of the silenced distress beacon. She tightened her grip on the edge of the holotable, looking up at the cold metal of Revan's mask. The vocabulator emitted a flat, mechanical tone as Revan issued the next set of coordinates, entirely bypassing the lost outpost. Revan utilized Republic infantry battalions as bait to draw the Mandalorian fleets into vulnerable positions. He ordered specific divisions to hold indefensible valleys, knowing the Mandalorian commanders would commit their heavy armor to crush the exposed troops. As the enemy Basilisk war droids descended into the valleys, Revan signaled the Republic artillery stationed on the surrounding ridges. The heavy cannons fired simultaneously, obliterating both the Mandalorian forces and the Republic bait units in massive thermal explosions. Revan read the casualty reports of his own troops, deleted the files from his datapad, and mapped out the next planetary invasion. The Republic fleet advanced steadily, pushing the Mandalorian armada backward system by system. Revan stood at the viewport, watching the trails of the retreating enemy warships burn through the starfield. The projected flight paths converged on a specific set of coordinates in the outer rim. Revan turned to Malak and Meetra Surik, his metallic voice issuing a directive to gather every available Republic cruiser, dreadnought, and fighter squadron. He ordered the fleet to jump to light speed, setting their navigational computers for a barren, storm-ravaged planet known as Malachor Vive. He then instructed Meetra Surik and a team of Republic engineers to finalize the construction of a massive gravitational superweapon, preparing to end the war entirely in the atmosphere of the dead world. The Republic fleet dropped out of hyperspace above the jagged, storm-swept crust of Malachor V in the year 3960 before the Battle of Yavin. Lightning arced across the thick green gas clouds, covering the barren rock below. Revan positioned his dreadnoughts in a tight defensive perimeter, placing the bulk of the Republic armada directly in the path of the advancing Mandalorian fleet. Flashes of red and green plasma lit up the dark void between the ships as the enemy cruisers entered firing range. Squadron commanders barked target locks over the comm channels, while astromech droids calculated evasive maneuvers. Down on the planet's surface, deep within a fortified bunker, General Mitra Surik stood over the control console of the mass shadow generator. The machine consisted of massive durasteel pylons driven directly into the planetary core, connected by thick power cables that pulsed with blue electrical energy. Mitra watched the tactical readouts, waiting for the Mandalorian fleet to move fully into the gravitational range of the device. High above the surface, Revan boarded the Mandalorian flagship. He cut through the heavy bulkheads with his blue lightsaber, leaving glowing rims of melted steel along the corridor walls. He stepped onto the command deck and confronted Mandalore the Ultimate. The Mandalorian leader wore thick, overlapping plates of silver Beskar armor and carried a massive vibroaxe that vibrated with a loud mechanical hum. Mandalore charged forward, swinging the heavy axe in a wide horizontal arc. Revan pivoted on his heel, using his smaller stature to slip past the heavy swings, and struck the silver armor with a flurry of rapid lightsaber slashes. Showers of yellow sparks illuminated the command deck as the plasma blade connected with the Beskar plating. Mandalore pushed back, driving his heavy boots into the metal floor and delivering a downward strike. Revan raised his blade, catching the axe on the plasma beam and locking the weapons together. He twisted his wrists, redirecting the momentum of the axe and driving the tip of his lightsaber straight through the gaps in Mandalore's chest plating. The Mandalorian leader collapsed onto the metal deck, his weapon clattering loudly against the grating. As Mandalore fell, the entire Mandalorian fleet pushed forward, completely engulfing the Republic lines in a crossfire of heavy lasers and proton torpedoes. The Republic ships fractured under the concentrated assault, their hulls venting oxygen and burning debris into space. Revan transmitted a single encoded signal down to the planetary surface. Mitra Surik received the signal on her console. She looked at the flashing red indicators, showing thousands of Republic and Mandalorian ships locked in close-quarters combat above her. She placed her hand over the primary activation lever of the mass shadow generator and pulled it downward. The heavy pylons embedded in the crust of Malachor V discharged a massive pulse of gravitational energy. A deep, seismic tremor shook the entire planet, cracking the permacrete floors of the command bunker. The artificial gravity field projected upward into the orbital space, seizing the fleets in an invisible, crushing grip. The heavy durasteel hulls of the Mandalorian cruisers crumpled inward, their support beams snapping loudly before the ships folded into tight, compressed spheres of metal. The Republic vessels caught in the blast radius suffered the exact same physical collapse. Escape pods, fighter craft, and dreadnoughts shattered under the immense pressure, raining millions of tons of twisted debris down onto the planet's surface. The atmospheric pressure spiked, crushing the glass viewports of the descending dropships. Crew members floated into the vacuum, freezing instantly in the cold expanse. The gravitational shear tore into the crust of Malachor V itself, fracturing the tectonic plates and splitting the continents into jagged shards of floating rock. The green storms thickened with dust and pulverized steel, covering a massive graveyard of crushed starships. Mitra Surik survived the planetary fracture, standing in the ruins of her command bunker. She unclipped her lightsaber from her belt and looked up through the shattered ceiling at the debris field orbiting the broken world. The physical trauma of the planetary collapse caused her to physically recoil and shut her eyes tightly. The sounds of shifting rock and cooling metal filled her ears, replacing the hum of the Force she had previously felt in her daily meditations. She boarded a surviving Republic shuttle, returned to the Jedi Council on Coruscant, and placed her lightsaber on the stone floor of the high tower. The Jedi Masters pointed toward the landing pads, instructing her to leave the temple and spend the rest of her life in the Outer Rim. Mitra turned and walked back to the transport ships, beginning a long, solitary exile. The remaining Mandalorian survivors, stripped of their leader and their fleets, surrendered their weapons and scattered across the galaxy to find work in mercenary and bounty-hunting guilds. Revan stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the jagged remnants of Malachor V rotate slowly through the debris field. He looked at the crushed hulls of the warships drifting against the backdrop of the Outer Rim. He reviewed the casualty logs on his datapad, scrolling through the millions of names listed in red text. He stored the visual records of the shattered hulls into his personal terminal. He turned away from the viewport and examined the navigation charts retrieved from Mandalore's databanks. The coordinates pointed away from Republic space, extending outward into the dark, unmapped sectors of the unknown regions. He handed the charts to Malak, pointing a gloved finger at the distant stars, bypassing the victory celebrations preparing in the core worlds and setting a direct course for the edge of the galaxy. Revan stood inside the primary interrogation cell of his flagship, surrounded by captured Mandalorian officers. The prisoners sat on metal stools, their heavy armor stripped away, clad in their sweat-stained flight suits. Revan held a datapad retrieved from Mandalore's personal command console. He swiped through the encrypted supply manifests and flight logs. He cross-referenced the ore shipments and fuel reserves utilized by the Mandalorian fleet during the early stages of the invasion. The numbers displayed a massive discrepancy. The Mandalorian clans possessed specific hyperdrive technologies and heavy repeating blasters originating outside their own manufacturing capabilities. The refined coaxium fueling their capital ships carried chemical signatures matching uncharted refineries beyond the Outer Rim. Revan examined the schematics of the heavy weaponry, tracing the power conduits and targeting arrays. The designs required industrial facilities far larger than the Mandalorian forge worlds. Malak leaned over a glowing astrogation chart in the center of the room. The blue light traced the specific hyperspace jumps made by Mandalore the Ultimate in the months preceding the war. The trails extended past the established trade routes, crossing the Outer Rim boundary and terminating in the dense, unmapped star clusters of the unknown regions. Revan placed his gloved hand on the hollow table, tracing the blue line into the dark void. The physical evidence indicated an external supplier operating from the uncharted sectors of the galaxy. Revan determined the Republic remained exposed to this unknown faction. He kept his Mandalorian mask locked in place, retaining his military command structure and silencing the incoming transmissions from the core worlds. The Republic Senate broadcasted continuous HoloNet messages across the fleet frequencies, demanding the immediate return of the Armada and the demobilization of the revanchist forces. Revan manually severed the comlink connections. He diverted Republic supply convoys, hoarding Tibanna gas, proton torpedoes, and medical colto within the cargo bays of his dreadnoughts. He ordered the engineering crews to weld additional heavy plating onto the hulls of the capital ships. Malak walked the hangar decks, inspecting the repaired fighter squadrons and directing the infantry units to maintain their combat readiness. The revanchist Jedi kept their lightsabers clipped to their belts and their plastoid armor strapped over their tunics. They followed Revan's directives, loading crates of high-yield explosives and atmospheric survival gear into the transport shuttles. Revan gathered his most loyal commanders in the tactical briefing room. He displayed the retrieved navigation charts, projecting the specific coordinates located deep within the unknown regions. He detailed the undocumented supply lines, the anomalous weapon schematics, and the specialized hyperdrives. He laid out a plan to preemptively strike the hidden suppliers, tracing the logistical chain back to its source. The gathered officers and Jedi Knights nodded in agreement, locking their armor clasps and returning to their assigned stations. The vast majority of the revanchist forces stayed aboard Revan's fleet, trusting his tactical assessment of the physical evidence. The heavy thrusters of the Republic Armada ignited, pushing the dreadnoughts out of the Malachor system. The fleet flew past the established hyperlanes, leading back to Coruscant. The pilots angled the bows of the warships toward the dense nebulae and shifting asteroid fields of the galactic perimeter. Revan stood at the main viewport, watching the dense cluster of stars ahead. The pilots manually adjusted the navigation computers, steering the massive ships around uncharted black holes and localized gravitational anomalies. The starlight filtered through the thick glass, casting long, sharp shadows across the metal ridges of Revan's mask. Malak joined Revan at the viewport, his heavy boots sounding against the metal grating of the deck. The two commanders watched the familiar constellations disappear from the rear sensors, replaced entirely by the dense, erratic star fields of the unexplored territories. The fleet traveled for weeks, relying entirely on the decrypted coordinates pulled from Mandalore's databanks. The crews maintained strict silence protocols, keeping the ship-wide communications encrypted and the sensor arrays operating at maximum capacity. They scanned the surrounding void for thermal signatures, artificial satellites, and orbital defense platforms. The navigation computers emitted a sharp, repeating chime. The blue holographic map on the central console updated, displaying a large, terrestrial planet omitted from the Republic archives. Heavy electrical storms rolled across the upper atmosphere of the world, visible through the viewports as continuous flashes of purple and white lightning. Massive orbital shipyards hung in the planet's gravitational pull, surrounded by geometric formations of warships bearing an ancient angular design. The armor plating of the unknown ships absorbed the light from the nearby sun, reflecting a dull, blood-red sheen. Revan ordered the fleet to hold position on the outer edge of the system. He and Malak boarded a small, stealth-equipped shuttle, leaving the Armada behind as they descended through the violent atmospheric storms to investigate the dark surface below. The small stealth shuttle descended through the violent electrical storms of the uncharted planet. Heavy rain battered the permacrete landing pad as the boarding ramp lowered into the dark. Revan and Malak stepped out of the shuttle and walked directly into the freezing downpour. Thick bolts of purple lightning illuminated the skyline of a sprawling metropolis built from black stone and durasteel. Massive obsidian towers reached up into the heavy cloud cover. Columns of soldiers wearing grey and black armor marched across the lower courtyards in perfect, synchronized squares. These troops carried the exact heavy repeating blasters Revan had identified in the Mandalorian supply manifests. The two Jedi walked quietly through the rain-slicked streets, observing the physical infrastructure of the alien capital. Giant automated factories expelled thick plumes of black smoke into the upper atmosphere. Crimson banners marked with angular geometric symbols hung from the high stone archways. Beings with bright red skin and bone spurs protruding from their facial ridges moved through the thoroughfares, wearing heavy robes and carrying cylindrical lightsaber hilts on their belts. Revan and Malak watched these red-skinned individuals command the armored soldiers. They had located the source of the Mandalorian war supplies. The ancient Sith Empire had survived its historical defeats, rebuilding its foundries and training a massive army in complete isolation. Revan and Malak approached the central citadel at the heart of the city. They walked up a wide flight of stone steps and entered the main corridors of the fortress. The temperature inside the citadel dropped sharply, and the thick basalt walls muffled the thunder crashing outside. Polished black marble lined the floors, reflecting the dim red light of wall-mounted braziers. The two Jedi advanced past the heavily armored guards stationed at the intersections. They utilized the Force to manipulate the optical nerves of the sentries, clouding the guards' vision and stepping silently through the heavy durasteel blast doors. They moved with strict military precision, advancing directly into the primary throne room of the citadel. At the center of the vast circular chamber, a single figure sat on an elevated throne carved from jagged obsidian. The Sith Emperor wore layered black robes that absorbed the dim light from the braziers. His skin possessed a gray, ash-like pallor, stretched tight over his facial bones. His eyes consisted entirely of solid black voids. Revan and Malak unclipped their lightsabers from their belts. The blue plasma blades ignited with a loud snap hiss, casting bright blue reflections across the dark stone walls and the polished marble floor. The two Jedi stepped forward, positioning themselves to strike the Emperor and eliminate the leader of the hidden faction. The Emperor remained seated on his obsidian throne. He kept his hands empty, raising his pale, grey fingers directly toward the advancing Jedi. A concentrated wave of dark side energy physically slammed into Revan and Malak. Revan's boots skidded backward across the smooth marble floor. His muscles locked rigidly in place, and the joints of his arms and legs seized under an immense, crushing pressure. The blue lightsaber slipped from his paralyzed fingers, deactivating as the metal hilt clattered against the stone tiles. Malak fell heavily to his knees beside him. Malak's heavy jaw clenched tight, and he gasped audibly as he struggled to draw air into his compressed lungs. The Emperor stepped down from the throne and walked slowly toward the immobilized Jedi. He extended his hands and pushed his consciousness straight into their minds. Revan experienced violent physical spasms. His vocal cords constricted, and the veins along his neck and temples bulged visibly against his skin. The dark energy flooded his nervous system, rewriting his neural pathways and altering his physical connection to the Force. Under the metal visor of his Mandalorian mask, Revan's eyes shifted, the irises burning from a natural hue to a bright, sulphurous yellow. Malak underwent the exact same physical transformation, his breathing slowing to a deep, mechanical rhythm as the dark side saturated his body. The invisible pressure released, allowing Revan and Malak to drop fully to the floor. They rested their hands on the cold marble, bowing their heads toward the dark figure standing above them. The Emperor spoke, his voice vibrating through the stone chamber and rattling the metal fixtures on the walls. He anointed them with new titles, naming them Darth Revan and Darth Malak. He gave the newly minted Sith Lords direct orders to serve as the advance vanguard of his military forces. He instructed them to return to Republic space, locate a series of ancient star maps left behind by a species called the Rakata, and find an automated manufacturing facility known as the Star Forge. He tasked them with using this factory to construct an invasion fleet and dismantle the Republic's remaining defenses, clearing the path for the Sith Empire's eventual return. Darth Revan and Darth Malak rose from the floor. They retrieved their lightsaber hilts and hooked them back onto their utility belts. They turned their backs on the Emperor, walking in perfect synchronization toward the exit of the Citadel. They boarded their stealth shuttle and lifted off through the thunderstorms of Dromund Kaas. The shuttle angled its nose back toward the known galaxy. The two Dark Lords sat at the controls, inputting the initial search parameters for the ancient Rakatan map pieces, setting out to claim the automated foundries of the Starforge and wage a new war against the Republic. The stealth shuttle entered the atmosphere of various planets scattered across the galaxy. Revan and Malak walked across the sprawling golden grasslands of Dantooine, the rolling sand dunes of Tatooine, the wooden walkways built over the dense forest canopies of Kashyyyk, and the dark red sands of Korriban. On each world, they located subterranean chambers built from smooth, dark stone. Inside these chambers stood angular technological devices constructed by the ancient Rakata species. When Revan placed his bare hands over the consoles, the metal panels shifted, projecting glowing three-dimensional star maps into the air. The maps displayed incomplete coordinates, plotting a specific hyperspace route into an uncharted sector of the galaxy. Revan and Malak copied the glowing blue coordinates into their datapads, assembling the scattered pieces of the navigational puzzle. As the two Sith Lords spent months traveling between these isolated planets, the vast physical distance from Dromund Kaas severed their direct connection to the Sith Emperor. The dark energy that had flooded their neural pathways stabilized and integrated with their own consciousness. Revan stood in the cockpit of the shuttle, watching the starlight stream through the viewport. He processed the physical reality of the hidden Sith Empire and the massive army preparing to invade the known galaxy. He reviewed the recent military performance of the Republic on his datapad, noting the depleted fleets, the slow supply lines, and the fractured command structures. He observed the Republic's physical vulnerabilities and determined the galaxy required a rigid, centralized military autocracy under his direct command to survive the impending invasion. Revan formulated a new tactical objective and set a course to conquer the Republic himself. Revan formulated a new tactical objective and set a course to conquer the Republic himself. Revan walked into the small cargo hold of the shuttle and retrieved his scorched Mandalorian mask. He locked the metal plate over his face, snapping the atmospheric seals into place. He turned to Malak, his voice vibrating through the internal vocabulator. He declared his supremacy, taking the title of Dark Lord of the Sith, and designated Malak as his subordinate apprentice. Malak bowed his head, lowering his eyes to the metal floor, acknowledging the hierarchy and accepting his position. They discarded the grey robes of the hidden emperor and donned dark armor tailored to their own specifications. Revan wrapped himself in heavy black cloth and a dark crimson cape, covering his rigid armor plating. He integrated his red-bladed lightsaber into his utility belt. The transition finalized their shift in allegiance. They functioned as independent conquerors, establishing their own Sith empire to rival the one they had discovered. The stealth shuttle returned to the Republic Armada, waiting at the edge of the unknown regions. Revan boarded his flagship and summoned his generals to the command deck. He stood before the officers and the revanchist Jedi, flanked by Malak. The glowing red plasma of their ignited lightsabers cast harsh light across the metal bulkheads. Revan presented his new directives. He ordered the fleet to turn its weapons against the Republic. He offered the commanders a choice between absolute loyalty to his new Sith Empire or immediate execution. The vast majority of the veterans, conditioned by years of brutal warfare on the Outer Rim and deeply loyal to Revan's tactical brilliance, knelt on the metal deck and pledged their allegiance. The Jedi who resisted died on the polished floors of the bridge. Red plasma blades pierced their chests, and their bodies collapsed onto the grating. Maintenance crews painted over the Republic insignias on the hull plates with the jagged crimson emblems of the new Sith Empire. The unified fleet turned back toward the core worlds. Revan directed the armadas with the same calculated precision he had utilized against the Mandalorians. Sith cruisers dropped out of hyperspace above key Republic supply depots, firing heavy laser batteries into the planetary defense grids. Ground troops wearing dark armor marched out of the dropships, securing the spaceports and seizing the orbital dry docks. They marched through civilian plazas with raised blaster rifles, enforcing curfews and executing Republic loyalists against the permacrete walls. Revan paced the tactical bridge of his flagship, watching the holotable display the retreating Republic fleets. He mapped out the invasion routes, isolating the major shipyards and securing the hyperlanes. Republic soldiers dropped their weapons and abandoned their outposts under the sudden, organized assault from their former supreme commander. Planetary governors surrendered their sectors within days, handing their physical resources over to Revan's growing war machine. Despite the rapid territorial gains, the continuous planetary assaults drained the ammunition reserves and the fuel supplies of the Sith fleet. Revan required a massive industrial base to maintain the momentum of the invasion and fully dismantle the Republic infrastructure. He returned to the main navigational console and input the compiled coordinates retrieved from the ancient Rakatan devices. The computer processed the data, charting a clear trajectory through a highly unstable star cluster. Revan ordered the entire armada to jump to light speed. The ships stretched into white streaks, exiting hyperspace in a system dominated by a massive, pulsing blue star. Hanging directly in orbit above the local sun, a colossal metallic structure blocked out the light, casting long, dark shadows across the command deck of the flagship. Revan walked to the heavy glass-steel viewport and looked at the ancient, automated foundries waiting to be claimed. Revan and Malak piloted their stealth shuttle toward the massive structure orbiting the blue star. The star forge spanned hundreds of kilometers in width, hovering in the vacuum of space above the swirling solar flares. 3 central fins extended downward from the main spherical body, dipping directly into the star's upper corona. These fins acted as massive siphons, drawing a continuous, turbulent stream of superheated plasma upward into the belly of the station. The harvested solar matter traveled through thick, transparent conduits lining the exterior hull, glowing with a blinding white light and radiating intense heat that raised the ambient temperature inside the shuttle's cockpit. The outer hull of the station consisted of dark, porous stone interwoven with unknown metallic alloys. Carved geometric Rakatan glyphs covered the surface, tracking along the massive docking bays located in the equatorial trench. The shuttle passed through a localized magnetic containment field and touched down on the wide, empty deck of a primary hangar. Revan stepped down the metal ramp, his heavy leather boots clapping against hexagonal stone floor tiles. The air inside the station hung perfectly still, smelling of copper wire, burnt ozone, and ancient dust. Malak walked beside him, holding his lightsaber hilt ready. Automated defense turrets tracked their approach, swiveling on heavy motorized mounts. Red targeting lasers swept across the dark armor of the 2 Sith Lords. Revan raised his gloved hand, channeling his bioelectrical energy and pushing a physical shockwave of dark side force toward the central control terminal. The heavy blast doors slid open, grinding against unlubricated tracks, and the automated turrets immediately powered down. The station's sensors registered the specific dark energy flowing through Revan's neural pathways, unlocking the primary access corridors and granting him control over the manufacturing decks. The two commanders walked onto the central factory floor. The chamber stretched for several miles, with a ceiling towering hundreds of meters above their heads. Thousands of thick mechanical arms descended from the upper scaffolding. These arms channeled the harvested solar plasma, cooling and synthesizing the raw matter into hardened durasteel plates and plastoid components. Conveyor belts, the size of city blocks, moved steadily beneath them, carrying the skeletal frames of massive warships. Bright blue and yellow welding lasers flashed continuously, sealing armor sections onto the hulls of Centurion-class battlecruisers and Interdictor-class dreadnoughts. On the lower levels, precision laser cutters shaved sheets of metal into the cylindrical chassis of Sith assault droids. Hydraulic presses stamped out thousands of blaster rifles per minute, while mechanical loaders stacked the finished weapons into large transport crates. The factory operated entirely without organic workers, maintaining a rapid, continuous pace of mass production. Operating the machinery of the Starforge demanded a severe physical toll from its users. Revan stood before the main command console, placing his hands flat against the carved stone interface to direct the manufacturing output. The temperature in the immediate vicinity plummeted instantly. A thick layer of white frost formed along the edges of his Mandalorian mask, spreading across his armored shoulders and the polished floor tiles. The console actively siphoned the bioelectrical energy from Revan's body. His heart rate slowed to a deep, heavy thump, and the blood vessels beneath his skin constricted tight. The flesh around his neck and wrists turned pale and cold. The geometric glyphs on the walls pulsed with a dark red light, matching the rhythmic, labored expansion of Revan's lungs. The station drained his physical stamina, utilizing his dark side resonance as a biological catalyst to accelerate the synthesis of the starship hulls. Revan gripped the edges of the console, locking his elbows and allowing the machinery to pull the energy from his muscles to fuel the endless production lines. Malak stood right next to him, placing his own hands on a secondary control panel and experiencing the exact same physiological drain. He leaned his heavy frame against the stone console, his breathing growing shallow and jagged. The dark energy transfer caused his jaw muscles to clench so hard his teeth ground together audibly. They maintained their grip, pushing through the cold and the physical exhaustion. Outside the thick glass-steel viewports, the completed warships drifted out of the docking bays and aligned into tight, overlapping attack formations. Hundreds of heavily armed cruisers blotted out the light of the blue star, casting dark shadows over the remaining construction yards. Sith fighter squadrons swarmed around the capital ships in tight clusters, their twin ion engines leaving bright red exhaust trails against the blackness of space. Automated transport shuttles ferried millions of newly manufactured combat droids onto the dreadnoughts, locking them into the cargo holds alongside rows of synthesized heavy artillery. Revan stepped back from the command console and dropped his hands to his sides. The red glyphs on the walls dimmed to a faint glow, and the air temperature in the room slowly rose back to a standard level. He reached up and wiped the melting frost from the dark, T-shaped visor of his mask. His chest heaved as he pulled deep breaths of the copper-scented air back into his lungs. He now possessed the absolute industrial capacity required to sustain a galactic invasion indefinitely. The Starforge provided a limitless supply of warships, weapons, and mechanized infantry, entirely bypassing the need for civilian supply chains, mining colonies, or Republic trade routes. Revan turned his back to the massive viewport and walked down the long corridor toward the hangar bay, his black cape dragging across the stone tiles. Malak followed closely behind, his heavy boots echoing in the massive chamber. They boarded their stealth shuttle and flew out to the lead dreadnought of their newly constructed armada. Revan took his place on the elevated tactical bridge, looking down at the glowing holographic map of the Republic core worlds, ready to deploy his limitless fleet against the very planets he had once sworn to defend. Darth Revan deployed the newly constructed Sith Armada into the primary hyperlanes of the Republic. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, reviewing the structural schematics of Republic shipyards and supply lines on the glowing holotable. He observed the slow response times of the Republic defense fleets and the fragmented communication relays between sector governors. He utilized this data to execute a coordinated, overwhelming offensive. Sith dreadnoughts dropped out of hyperspace above agricultural and industrial worlds, physically blocking orbital trade routes and severing planetary communications. The automated transports from the Star Forge descended through the atmospheres, delivering thousands of heavy assault droids onto the surface of these planets. Revan established a rigid military autocracy, placing his own dark-armored commanders in direct control of the civilian populations. He calculated that a single, unified command structure could fortify the galaxy against the hidden threat of the unknown regions, and he used his military forces to systematically dismantle the existing Republic government to achieve this unification. The conflict immediately divided the ranks of the Jedi Order. Hundreds of Jedi Knights and Padawans left the temples on Coruscant and Dantooine, boarding transport shuttles and flying directly to Revan's staging grounds. These Force users remembered Revan's tactical commands during the Mandalorian Wars and chose to follow his orders once again. They discarded their traditional beige tunics, equipping themselves with the dark robes and heavy armor of the Sith Empire. In the training rings and on the battlefields, these defectors dismantled their lightsabers, replacing their blue and green crystals with synthetic crimson variants. They clashed directly with their former masters and peers. Red lightsabers struck against blue and green blades in the tight corridors of Republic outposts and across the muddy trenches of contested worlds. The plasma strikes left deep, glowing scorch marks across stone walls and armor plates. The galaxy plunged into a widespread internal conflict, pitting former allies and students against each other in a series of brutal, close-quarters engagements. Revan stood at the center of this widespread conflict, wearing the scorched Mandalorian mask. The dark, T-shaped visor became the primary visual identifier of the Sith invasion. Republic propaganda holos displayed his masked face across the news grids, broadcasting his image alongside scrolling tallies of destroyed defense fleets and captured star systems. When Revan walked through the captured Republic military bases, his heavy boots clamped against the metal decking, and his dark armor and flowing cape absorbed the harsh light of the overhead fluorescent panels. His followers saluted him, their eyes fixed on the immovable metal plate covering his features. He issued commands in a deep, mechanically filtered voice, directing fleet bombardments and infantry deployments without displaying any physical signs of hesitation or fatigue. The mask concealed his biological identity entirely, projecting the permanent, rigid presence of the Dark Lord over the armies he commanded. Supported by the endless manufacturing capabilities of the Star Forge, the Sith Armada expanded its territorial control at a rapid pace. Revan directed a massive flotilla toward the barren, red sand surface of Korriban. The Sith ships descended through the thin atmosphere and landed near the Valley of the Dark Lords. Revan and Malak walked down the transport ramps and stepped onto the dusty, rust-colored soil. They surveyed the crumbling stone tombs and massive statues of ancient Sith conquerors. Revan ordered his engineering corps to construct a new Sith academy directly over the ruins. Heavy construction vehicles cleared the debris, laying durasteel foundations and erecting thick stone walls. Within weeks, dark-robed acolytes filled the training yards of the new academy, practicing lightsaber combat and channeling bioelectrical dark-side energy into the surrounding environment. Korriban resumed its historical function as a central training hub for the growing Sith forces. Revan utilized the trained acolytes and the manufactured warships to crush the remaining Republic resistance. He executed pincer maneuvers in the deep space sectors, trapping Republic cruisers between walls of heavy Sith dreadnoughts. Red turbo laser fire stripped the deflector shields from the Republic vessels, melting through the outer hull plating and detonating the internal hyperdrives. The glass steel viewports of the Republic bridges shattered under the immense heat, venting atmosphere and crew members into the freezing vacuum. The wreckage of the Republic defense fleets drifted across dozens of star systems, leaving trails of frozen coolant, exposed wiring, and twisted durasteel in their wake. Republic admirals ordered full retreats, pulling their surviving ships back toward the heavily fortified core worlds. Revan pursued them relentlessly, calculating the trajectory of every fleeing vessel and positioning his own armadas to intercept them at their designated rendezvous points. The Sith Armada secured the outer rim and began its push toward the core of the Republic. Revan stationed his flagship at the vanguard of the fleet, preparing to execute a coordinated strike against the primary Republic shipyards. He stood at the holotable, reviewing the precise coordinates for the upcoming engagement, mapping out a direct path to total victory. As the Sith fleet jumped into the targeted system, the sensor arrays on Revan's flagship registered a dense cluster of Republic cruisers holding position directly ahead. The Republic forces held a specialized strike team inside a boarding shuttle, relying on a unique, localized manipulation of the Force emanating from one of their young Jedi commanders to coordinate their defense. The small Republic shuttle detached from the defensive line, igniting its thrusters and flying straight toward the main hangar bay of Revan's dreadnought. The Republic transport shuttle crossed the narrow gap between the engaged fleets and fired its forward repulsor engines. The shuttle smashed directly through the magnetic containment field of the Sith flagship's primary hangar bay. The heavy durasteel hull of the transport screeched against the deck plates, tearing a long, jagged trench through the polished floor tiles before slamming into a row of automated cargo loaders. The boarding ramp dropped instantly, crashing onto the metal grating. A squad of Republic troopers poured out of the troop compartment, firing their heavy blaster rifles at the dark-armored Sith guards. At the center of this advancing squad walked a young Jedi named Bastila Shan. She wore form-fitting brown leather armor over a gray tunic, her dark hair pulled back into a tight, functional braid. She held a long, cylindrical lightsaber hilt in both hands, activating twin beams of yellow plasma from either end. Bastila stepped out of the heavy blaster fire and closed her eyes. She inhaled deeply, lowering her lightsaber and planting her boots flat on the metal grating. A visible ripple of static electricity traveled across the nearby console screens. She utilized a specialized technique, projecting a network of bioelectrical signals outward into the minds of the Republic crews. Outside the flagship, the physical effects of this projection manifested immediately across the battlefield. The Republic fighter squadrons tightened their formations. The tactical fighters executed synchronized banking maneuvers, separated by only a few meters of space, firing proton torpedoes in perfect unison while maintaining strict radio silence. Republic gunners adjusted their targeting yokes simultaneously, tracking the erratic movements of the Sith cruisers and landing direct hits on their primary thrusters. Inside the Sith hangar, the Republic troopers stepped forward in a unified line. Their posture straightened, their hands steadied, and their blaster bolts struck the center mass of the Sith defenders with absolute precision. Conversely, the Sith forces experienced a sudden drop in their physical coordination. Sith gunners hesitated at their consoles, their fingers slipping on the firing triggers. The dark-armored infantry inside the hangar broke their defensive lines, stepping directly into the path of incoming blaster fire. The localized manipulation of the Force stabilized the central nervous systems of the Republic forces, while simultaneously disrupting the spatial awareness and timing of the Sith defenders. Bastila opened her eyes and sprinted forward, spinning her double-bladed lightsaber in wide, horizontal arcs. The yellow plasma sliced through the heavy blast doors at the edge of the hangar. Molten steel dripped onto the floor as the strike team breached the central corridor. Sith acolytes ran toward them, swinging red lightsabers and firing short-barreled blasters. Bastila deflected the incoming strikes, stepping inside their guard and driving the hilt of her weapon into their chest plates. 2 more Jedi Knights flanked her, wielding green and blue blades. They moved through the narrow hallways of the dreadnought, cutting down the Sith infantry and bypassing the internal security grids. Smoke filled the corridors, smelling of melted wire, ozone, and charred plastoid armor. The Republic strike team advanced deck by deck, climbing the internal access ladders and moving methodically toward the primary command bridge. On the command bridge, Darth Revan stood at the central holotable. He watched the blue holographic markers representing his fighter squadrons blink and disappear as the Republic forces dismantled his defensive screens. He looked at the internal security feeds on his datapad. The monitors displayed Bastila and her strike team clearing the final set of blast doors just outside the bridge. Revan powered down the holotable. He unclipped his lightsaber from his belt and held it at his side. The mechanical servos of the heavy durasteel doors engaged, sliding the thick metal panels apart. Bastila stepped onto the bridge, her yellow lightsaber humming loudly in the enclosed space. The Republic troopers fanned out along the walls, aiming their rifles directly at Revan's chest. The 2 Jedi Knights took up positions on either side of Bastila, locking their boots onto the metal floor and raising their weapons. Revan held his position in silence. The atmospheric seals of his Mandalorian mask hissed slightly as he regulated his breathing. He stepped away from the console, drawing his dark cape back over his shoulder to free his arm. He ignited his lightsaber, projecting a thick, red plasma blade that cast a crimson glow over his armored chest plate and the polished floor tiles. Bastila raised her double-bladed weapon, bending her knees and shifting her weight forward. The Republic troopers disengaged the safety switches on their rifles, the mechanical clicks echoing loudly across the quiet bridge. Revan raised his blade, angling the red plasma toward Bastila's neck. He evaluated the physical spacing between the troopers, calculating the exact sequence of strikes required to eliminate the Jedi team. As the combatants braced their legs and prepared to strike, the primary viewport behind Revan displayed the shifting profile of another Sith dreadnought. Malak's personal flagship broke away from the main battle line and drifted out of the Republic crossfire. The massive warship accelerated through the debris field, aligning its heavy prow directly behind Revan's vessel. Along the hull of Malak's cruiser, the heavy turbo-laser batteries rotated on their motorized mounts. The massive cannons powered up, glowing with concentrated green thermal energy, and locked their targeting sensors directly onto the command bridge of Revan's flagship. The heavy turbo lasers of Darth Malak's cruiser discharged a concentrated barrage of green thermal energy. The massive beams crossed the vacuum of space and impacted the glass steel viewports of Revan's command bridge. The resulting explosion instantly vaporized the forward consoles and shattered the thick viewing panels. A concussive shockwave of expanding heat and pressure threw Revan, Bastila, and the Republic troopers backward across the room. Shrapnel from the destroyed control stations tore through the air, embedding into the metal bulkheads. The structural integrity of the ceiling failed, causing heavy durasteel support beams to collapse directly onto the polished floor tiles. The sudden depressurization pulled smoke and debris out into the freezing void of space before the emergency blast doors slammed shut, sealing the bridge off from the vacuum. Revan lay pinned beneath a thick, twisted section of the collapsed ceiling. The heavy impact cracked the left side of his Mandalorian mask, splitting the dark metal from the jawline to the temple. Deep scorch marks covered his dark chest armor, and blood pooled on the grating beneath his head. His breathing slowed to shallow, irregular gasps. The flickering orange light from the electrical fires cast long shadows over his still form. Bastila pushed herself up from the floor, shaking the dust from her brown leather armor. She deactivated her double-bladed lightsaber, hooking the metal cylinder onto her utility belt. She walked over the twisted debris and knelt directly beside the fallen Sith Lord. Bastila placed her bare hands flat against the cracked metal of Revan's chest plate. She closed her eyes and channeled raw force energy into his failing biological systems. A visible pulse of blue light traveled from her palms, sinking deep into his thoracic cavity. This sustained energy transfer forced Revan's heart to resume a steady rhythm and stabilized the ruptured blood vessels inside his chest. The continuous flow of bioelectrical power forged a permanent, physical link between their nervous systems. Their brainwaves synchronized, binding their physiological states together through the Force. Bastila maintained this connection, keeping the Dark Lord alive as the Republic troopers regrouped around them. The troopers grabbed the heavy straps of Revan's armor and lifted his inert body from the floor. They carried him down the smoke-filled corridors, stepping over the debris and returning to their boarding shuttle. They laid Revan on the metal floor of the troop compartment. The pilot ignited the repulsor lift engines, detaching the shuttle from the crippled flagship and accelerating into the debris field. The small Republic vessel engaged its hyperdrive, stretching into a white streak and disappearing from the sector. Meanwhile, Darth Malak stood on the bridge of his own dreadnought, watching the explosions ripple across his former master's ship. He signaled his communications officers, broadcasting a fleet-wide transmission announcing his immediate ascension to the rank of Dark Lord of the Sith. He assumed direct control over the automated manufacturing output of the Star Forge and ordered the Armada to continue its advance into the core worlds. The Republic shuttle landed on the wide, grassy plains of the planet Dantooine. Medical droids wheeled Revan on a floating repulsor stretcher deep into the subterranean healing wards of the Jedi Enclave. They submerged his broken body inside a cylindrical glass tank filled with pale blue colto fluid. The medicinal liquid knit his fractured bones together and regenerated his burned tissue over a period of several weeks. Once his physical injuries healed, the medical droids drained the tank and placed him on a flat surgical bed beneath a ring of bright illumination panels. Several members of the Jedi High Council gathered around the metal bed. They stood in a tight circle, observing the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. The Jedi Masters placed their fingertips directly against his temples and forehead. They synchronized their breathing and projected their combined force energy straight into his cerebral cortex. They physically suppressed the specific neural pathways containing his experiences of the Mandalorian Wars, the Sith Emperor, and the Star Forge. The Masters mapped completely new neurological patterns over the suppressed pathways. They implanted the detailed memories of a standard Republic soldier. They constructed a fabricated childhood on a core world, layered basic infantry training protocols into his muscle memory, and generated a history of ordinary fleet deployments. The raw energy of the Force physically altered the structure of his brain, replacing the identity of the Dark Lord with the persona of a loyal Republic citizen. The neurological reprogramming required absolute precision to maintain his basic motor functions and combat reflexes. The Jedi Masters stepped back from the surgical bed, breaking physical contact and allowing his brainwaves to stabilize. The medics dressed him in a standard olive-green Republic military uniform, removing his dark robes and his scorched Mandalorian mask. The Jedi Council handed him a datapad outlining his new deployment orders. They transferred him to a Republic Hammerhead-class cruiser named the Endar Spire. The Endar Spire currently held position in orbit above the towering city world of Taris, preparing to engage a massive Sith blockade assembling in the sector. The Endar Spire dropped out of hyperspace above the city world of Taris, immediately engaging the forward line of the Sith blockade. Red and green turbo laser bolts crossed the vacuum, illuminating the dark side of the planet. Sith fighter squadrons swarmed the Republic cruiser, targeting the primary sensor arrays and the sublight engines. Heavy concussive blasts shook the hull of the Endar Spire, buckling the Durasteel support columns and tearing long gashes in the outer plating. The emergency klaxons blared through the internal corridors, flashing red warning lights across the metal walls. Inside the portside crew quarters, a Republic soldier awoke on his metal bunk. He wore a simple grey flight suit, and a standard-issue blaster pistol rested in the holster strapped to his thigh. The neurological reprogramming held firm. He possessed no memory of the Mandalorian Wars, the Star Forge, or his former identity as the Dark Lord of the Sith. He simply grabbed his blaster and ran into the corridor, joining the Republic infantry squads rushing toward the primary escape pods. Sith boarding parties breached the outer airlocks, cutting through the heavy metal doors with portable plasma torches. Dark-armored shock troopers flooded into the narrow hallways, firing their heavy repeaters at the defending Republic crew. The reprogrammed soldier moved through the smoke, returning fire and dropping the leading Sith troopers. He covered the retreat of his fellow crew members, directing them toward the starboard escape hatches. As he reached the main access junction, Bastila Shan rushed past him, her yellow double-bladed lightsaber igniting to deflect a volley of incoming blaster fire. She did not acknowledge his presence or his face, focusing entirely on clearing a path to her own designated escape pod. The soldier reached the last available pod on the port side, alongside a Republic pilot named Carthonasi. They sealed the heavy hatch just as a massive secondary explosion ripped through the main drive core of the Endar Spire. The escape pod ejected forcefully from the crumbling cruiser, entering the upper atmosphere of Taris and plummeting toward the towering skyscrapers below. The pod crashed violently into the upper levels of a sprawling apartment complex, smashing through the glass steel windows and grinding to a halt on the permacrete floor. The soldier and Carth kicked open the jammed hatch, stepping out into the neon-lit corridors of the upper city. The structural layout of Taris separated the population by elevation. Wealthy citizens inhabited the clean, well-lit skyscrapers above the clouds, while the lower levels descended into darkness, pollution, and widespread gang violence. Sith occupation forces patrolled the upper walkways, conducting door-to-door searches and interrogating civilians to locate the surviving Republic crew members. The soldier and Carth stripped off their military uniforms, stealing plain civilian clothing from an abandoned apartment to blend in with the local population. They moved quietly through the bustling cantinas and the crowded transit stations, relying on Carth's knowledge of military evasion tactics and the soldiers' newly implanted combat instincts to avoid the Sith patrols. Their primary objective shifted entirely to locating Bastila Shan. Republic intelligence indicated her escape pod had landed in the Undercity, a subterranean sector completely controlled by rival swoop biker gangs. The soldier and Carth descended through the massive turbo elevators, leaving the sunlight behind. The air in the Undercity smelled of raw sewage, engine exhaust, and stale spice. Dim yellow glow lamps flickered over the rusted metal walkways and the overflowing trash compactors. The soldier navigated the gang territories, utilizing his blaster pistol and his physical agility to dismantle the local enforcers blocking their path. He engaged in high-speed swoop bike races, maneuvering the repulsor craft through narrow debris fields to win enough credits to buy information from the local crime lords. His physical reflexes proved significantly faster than the average Republic infantryman, a residual biological trait from his former life that remained intact despite the memory wipe. The trail led them into the deepest, unmapped sectors of the Undercity, directly into the territory of a violent swoop gang called the Black Vulcars. The soldier breached the main gates of the Vulcar base, engaging the heavy guards in close-quarters blaster combat. He cleared the central garage and found Bastila confined inside a heavy energy cage. He deactivated the localized force field, freeing the Jedi commander. Bastila recognized him immediately. She saw the face of Darth Revan, the man she had defeated aboard his own flagship, now fighting alongside a Republic pilot and carrying a standard blaster pistol. She maintained her composure, adhering to the strict instructions of the Jedi Council. She addressed him only by his fabricated military rank, keeping his true identity completely hidden. Together, the trio fought their way out of the Vulcar compound, returning to the upper levels of Taris to search for a ship capable of breaking through the Sith blockade in orbit. The soldier, Bastila, and Carth walked through the crowded, neon-lit corridors of the Taris upper city. They required a ship capable of penetrating the Sith orbital blockade. They located a Mandalorian mercenary named Canderous Ordo, leaning against a metal pillar inside a loud, smoke-filled cantina. Canderous wore thick silver armor plating over his chest and carried a heavy repeating blaster slung across his back. He provided them a direct infiltration route to a light freighter called the Ebon Hawk. The local crime lord, Davik Kang, held the ship locked inside his heavily fortified personal estate. The soldier and his team accepted the mercenaries' detailed plan. They gathered a blue astromech droid named T3M4 to interface with the security mainframes, along with a blue-skinned Twi'lek named Mission Vow and a tall, brown-furred Wookiee named Zalbar. The newly formed crew marched to the reinforced steel gates of Davik's compound. T3M4 extended a specialized slicing probe from a hidden compartment, inserting the spinning metal pin into the electronic lock of the security panel. Sparks showered from the console. The heavy blast doors slid open, grinding along their tracks. The soldier drew his blaster pistol, leading the group through the polished marble corridors of the estate. They engaged Davik's private security forces in close-quarters combat, firing red plasma bolts and leaving deep, blackened scorch marks across the ornate tapestries and stone pillars. The team pushed forward, stepping over the fallen guards and securing the intersecting hallways. High above the planet, Darth Malak stood on the command deck of his dreadnought. He looked down at the sprawling, interconnected city world of Taris through the thick glass-steel viewport. He raised his cybernetic metal jaw and issued a verbal command to his fleet admirals. He ordered the complete orbital bombardment of the planetary surface. The Sith cruisers aligned their heavy turbo-laser batteries with the densely populated urban centers below. They discharged continuous, blinding streams of concentrated green thermal energy directly into the towering skyscrapers. The heavy green beams struck the permacrete towers of Taris. The massive structures shattered under the intense heat, collapsing inward and sending thick, billowing clouds of pulverized glass and durasteel dust rolling through the lower streets. The ground beneath Davik's estate shook violently, throwing the mercenary guards off their feet. Large chunks of the vaulted ceiling fractured and crashed onto the polished floors. The soldier and his crew ran into the main hangar bay, boots clapping loudly against the metal grating. Davik Kang stood on the landing pad in front of the Ebon Hawk, holding a heavy blaster rifle alongside his bounty hunter associate. A green turbo laser blast struck the roof of the hangar directly above them. The ceiling gave way, and the resulting explosion crushed Davik under hundreds of tons of flaming debris. The soldier and his companions sprinted up the lowered hydraulic ramp of the Ebon Hawk. Karth slid into the leather pilot's seat, pulling back on the primary flight yoke and engaging the sublight repulsor engines. The Ebon Hawk lifted off the cracked hangar floor, flying straight up through the jagged hole in the burning ceiling. Karth navigated the freighter through the falling debris of the collapsing skyscrapers, banking sharply to avoid raining chunks of metal. He angled the ship's nose toward the upper atmosphere, pushing the thrusters to maximum output. The soldier strapped himself into the dorsal turret chair, gripping the dual firing handles. He tracked the Sith fighter squadrons diving toward their exhaust trail. He squeezed the triggers, firing rapid, alternating bursts of red laser cannons. The plasma bolts struck the pursuing fighters, blowing their wing panels apart and filling the view screen with expanding orange fireballs. The Ebon Hawk cleared the gravitational pull of Taris, breaking through the outer perimeter of the Sith blockade. Karth engaged the hyperdrive sequence. The stars stretched into long, brilliant white lines as the ship jumped into hyperspace, leaving the burning, fractured remains of the planet far behind. The freighter dropped out of light speed above the green and brown surface of Dantooine. Karth guided the ship down through the white clouds, extending the landing gear and touching down on a large circular permacrete pad. The loading ramp lowered with a loud hydraulic hiss. The soldier walked down the ramp, stepping onto the soft yellow grass. He smelled the damp soil, the fresh vegetation, and the clean air. He looked at the low, domed stone structures of the Jedi Enclave built directly into the sides of the surrounding hills. Republic guards stood at the entrance, holding long blaster rifles across their chests. Bastila walked past the guards, motioning for the soldier to follow her across the main courtyard. The soldier stepped into the central meeting chamber of the Enclave. The Jedi Masters sat on low wooden stools, arranged in a wide semicircle across the smooth stone floor. Master Vandar Tokare, a small green-skinned alien with long pointed ears, sat in the center. The Masters looked at the soldier standing in his olive-green military uniform. They observed his physical stance, the rapid movement of his eyes, and the thick calluses on his hands. They recognized the biological shell of the former Dark Lord, operating entirely under the parameters of their fabricated identity. Bastila stood beside him, reporting their violent escape from Taris, and detailing the soldiers' rapid physical reflexes during the combat engagements. Master Vandar leaned forward, resting his small, wrinkled hands on his wooden walking stick. He instructed the soldier to step into the exact center of the room. The masters prepared to initiate him into the ranks of the Jedi Order, laying the groundwork to place a lightsaber back into his hands and train him in the ways of the Force. The soldier stood in the open stone courtyard of the Dantooine enclave. The twin suns beat down on the permacrete tiles, radiating intense heat across the training grounds. Master Zar Lestin, a Twi'lek with mottled brown skin, paced across the tiles. Zar handed the soldier a cylindrical metal hilt with a cross-hatched rubber grip. The soldier pressed the ignition stud on the grip. A thick beam of blue plasma extended from the emitter, emitting a low, vibrating hum that vibrated through the bones in his forearm. He swung the blade through the air, practicing standard parries and vertical strikes. Sweat dripped down his forehead, soaking the collar of his heavy beige tunic and stinging his eyes. He planted his leather boots on the ground, twisting his torso to execute a heavy downward slash. His arm muscles executed the combat sequences programmed by the Jedi Council during his surgical procedure. He maintained perfect balance during the rapid transitions between offensive and defensive postures. Zar instructed him to deactivate the weapon and sit on a woven mat. The soldier crossed his legs and focused his biological senses on the surrounding environment. He listened to the water flowing over the smooth rocks in the nearby decorative fountains. He heard the wind rustling the broad leaves of the local blabber trees. Subsequently, he extended his hands, directing bioelectrical energy toward a cluster of small stones resting on the grass. The stones lifted from the ground, hovering exactly 3 feet in the air. After weeks of rigorous physical training, the soldier walked into the manufacturing workshop. He sat on a metal stool before a wide Durasteel workbench. Various mechanical components rested on the table, including power cells, focusing lenses, and metallic emitter shrouds. He picked up a small pair of metal tweezers, carefully inserting a blue Adagon crystal into the central housing chamber. He aligned the magnetic stabilizing ring over the crystal, tightening the screws with a micro-wrench. Moreover, he connected the power cell to the primary ignition switch, soldering the copper wires together. The smell of melting metal and burnt flux filled the small room. He snapped the outer cylindrical casing over the internal components, locking the pieces together with a sharp mechanical click. He stood up and gripped the metal hilt tightly in his right hand, feeling the coarse texture of the custom grip. He pressed the activator. A bright blue blade erupted from the tip, casting a harsh light over the workbench and radiating intense heat against his face. Master Zar observed the construction process from the doorway, nodding his head and conferring the formal title of Padawan upon the soldier. The Jedi Council summoned the Padawan back to the central meeting chamber. Master Vandar pointed his walking stick toward the open plains east of the enclave, describing a physical disturbance in the local energy field. The Padawan strapped his new lightsaber to his utility belt and walked out of the complex. Bastila Shan and Karth Onasi followed him across the wide, rolling hills of Dantooine. Tall, yellow grass brushed against their legs, leaving a fine coat of pollen on their boots. Large, horned predators, known as Kath hounds, charged at them from the thick brush, bearing sharp teeth. The Padawan ignited his blue lightsaber, slicing through the thick brown fur of the beasts. Karth provided covering fire, discharging red blaster bolts from his dual pistols into the remaining pack. They continued marching across the uneven terrain, reaching a massive mound of dark, porous stone rising out of the dirt. Carved geometric symbols covered the heavy stone doors set into the base of the mound. The Padawan approached the doors, placing his hands on the stone surface. The heavy panels slid apart, releasing a rush of stale, frigid air smelling of dry dirt and rusted metal. The group stepped into a wide, subterranean chamber. A heavy, ancient defense droid stood in the center of the room, raising a pair of heavy laser cannons. The Padawan sprinted across the stone tiles, diving under the incoming red plasma blasts. He swung his lightsaber in a tight upward arc, severing the mechanical joints of the droid's right leg. The massive machine crashed onto the floor. Bastila leaped over the falling chassis, driving her yellow double-bladed lightsaber directly into the droid's central power core. Sparks showered across the dark stone as the machine powered down permanently, emitting a sharp hiss of venting coolant. Behind the destroyed droid stood an angular, metallic terminal. The Padawan walked up to the device and pressed his palm against the control panel. The metal plates shifted and rotated, projecting a massive, three-dimensional holographic map into the air. The blue light illuminated the entire chamber, reflecting off the polished armor of the Republic team. The projection displayed the spherical shapes of 4 distinct planets: Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manaan, and Korriban. The glowing lines formed a partial navigational chart, outlining a specific physical route extending into the unknown regions. The Padawan recorded the planetary coordinates into his handheld datapad. The holographic projection flickered and deactivated, plunging the room back into dim shadows. The team hiked back across the grassy plains to the Jedi Enclave. They presented the datapad to the High Council. Master Vandar reviewed the coordinates, matching the ancient symbols to historical records of the Rakatan Infinite Empire. Consequently, the Council issued a new set of immediate combat orders. They commanded the Padawan and his crew to travel to all 4 listed planets, retrieve the remaining pieces of the navigational chart, and locate the Starforge factory producing the Sith Armada. The Padawan walked out of the Enclave across the Permacrete landing pad. He walked up the hydraulic ramp of the Ebon Hawk, finding the rest of his crew loading heavy weapon crates and concentrated fuel cells into the cargo bay. Canderous secured the supply lockers. Karth engaged the pre-flight sequence in the cockpit, powering up the sublight engines to launch the freighter toward the harsh desert climate of Tatooine. The Ebon Hawk descended through the dry atmosphere of Tatooine, extending its landing gear and settling onto the sand-covered permacrete of the Anchorhead spaceport. The heavy landing ramp lowered with a loud hiss of releasing pressure. The Padawan stepped out of the ship, his leather boots crunching against the coarse yellow sand. The twin suns baked the surface of the planet, radiating intense thermal energy that caused the air above the landing pad to shimmer and distort. The smell of burnt engine exhaust mixed with the dry, dusty air. The Padawan walked through the settlement, passing moisture vaporators that dripped condensation onto the cracked stone streets. He entered a small droid shop filled with mechanical parts and purchased a tall, rust-red assassin droid designated HK-47. The droid held a heavy blaster rifle across its metal chest, its visual sensors glowing with a bright orange light. HK-47 followed the Padawan back to the ship, adding heavy fire support to the Republic crew. The Padawan, Bastila, and HK-47 walked out of the settlement and marched directly into the vast expanse of the Dune Sea. The wind blew steady streams of loose sand against their clothing, filling the creases of their tunics and scratching against the droid's metal chassis. They navigated over steep dunes, tracking the specific coordinates listed on the datapad. They reached the mouth of a massive, dark cave embedded in a rocky canyon wall. The bones of large banthas littered the entrance. Inside the cavern, a massive crate dragon rested on the stone floor, its thick, scaled hide scraping against the rock walls. The Padawan packed a pile of heavy thermal detonators near the entrance and triggered the explosion. The concussive blast echoed through the canyon, collapsing the roof of the cavern and burying the massive creature under tons of shattered rock. The crew climbed over the debris and located the angular Rakatan terminal at the back of the cave. The Padawan placed his hand on the metal console, triggering the holographic projection, and recorded the updated hyperspace coordinates into his datapad. The crew returned to the Ebon Hawk and launched the freighter toward the forest world of Kashyyyk. The ship landed on a wide, circular platform constructed from heavy wooden logs. Massive Rocha trees stretched thousands of feet into the air, their thick trunks supporting a sprawling network of elevated walkways and suspended buildings. The air smelled of sweet sap, damp bark, and crushed leaves. The Padawan and his team stepped onto a large mechanical elevator platform. The wooden gears engaged, lowering them rapidly down the side of the massive tree trunk. They descended past the upper canopy, entering the lower levels known as the Shadowlands. The dense layers of leaves and branches completely obstructed the sunlight, leaving the forest floor covered in deep, persistent shadows. Thick roots the size of Republic shuttles twisted across the muddy ground. An older man named Jolie Bindo stepped out from behind a cluster of giant ferns. He wore a simple grey tunic and carried a lightsaber with a bright green plasma blade. Jolie joined the crew, guiding them through the dense, tangled undergrowth. Swarms of large, predatory insects called tuck dropped from the branches, snapping their mandibles. The Padawan and Jolie swung their lightsabers in tight, precise arcs, severing the chitinous legs of the insects. The glowing blue and green blades illuminated the dark, damp terrain. The group hacked through a wall of thick vines, revealing the next Rakatan terminal embedded directly into the root system of a dying Rocha tree. The Padawan accessed the console, transferring the blue holographic lines into his datapad and expanding the charted route. The Ebon Hawk departed the forest canopy, jumping to light speed and arriving over the aquatic planet of Manan. The freighter touched down on the pristine white permacrete landing pads of Arto City. The city consisted of interconnected floating platforms, completely surrounded by a vast, rolling blue ocean. The wind carried the heavy smell of salt water and refined colto fluid. The Padawan walked to the edge of the platform and boarded a small, pressurized submersible. The submersible detached from the city dock, sinking rapidly into the dark, freezing depths of the ocean. The heavy water pressure pressed against the thick glass-steel windows, causing the metal bulkheads to groan and pop. The craft docked with the underwater Harakat Rift Station. The Padawan stepped into the flooded corridors of the facility, donning a heavy, metallic environmental suit. He walked across the ocean floor, his lead-weighted boots sinking into the soft silt. He bypassed a massive Faraxan shark circling the area, using bursts of sonic energy from the station's emitters to drive the creature away. He entered the final flooded chamber and accessed the submerged Rakatan device. The terminal projected the final set of coordinates, completing the hyperspace route to the Star Forge. The Padawan returned to the submersible, ascended to the surface, and boarded the Ebon Hawk. Karth Onasi pushed the throttle forward, launching the freighter back into orbit and engaging the hyperdrive. The stars stretched into white lines, propelling the ship along the newly charted path. Suddenly, the navigation computer emitted a loud, continuous warning klaxon. The ship violently dropped out of light speed, throwing the crew forward against their restraint harnesses. The viewport displayed the massive, dark grey hull of an Interdictor-class Sith dreadnought directly in their flight path. The warship, designated the Leviathan, activated its primary tractor beam. A wide field of localized gravitational energy locked onto the Ebon Hawk, neutralizing the freighter's sublight engines. The massive dreadnought slowly pulled the small ship through the void of space, dragging it directly into the heavily fortified main hangar bay of Darth Malak's flagship. The tractor beam pulled the Ebon Hawk directly through the magnetic containment field of the Leviathan's main hangar bay. The freighter's landing struts hit the deck plates with a heavy metallic clang, and the magnetic clamps immediately locked the ship into place. Sith stormtroopers marched across the polished metal grating, raising their heavy repeating blasters and surrounding the lowered loading ramp. The Padawan, Bastila, and Karth walked down the ramp with their hands raised. A Republic admiral named Saul Karath stood at the front of the boarding party. He wore a crisp, dark grey Sith naval uniform, adorned with red rank cylinders. Admiral Karath instructed his troops to apply heavy stun cuffs to the prisoners' wrists and ordered them to transfer the captured crew directly to the primary detention block. The Sith troopers pushed the prisoners down the sterile, white-lit corridors of the dreadnought. They shoved the Padawan into a small isolation cell, locking him into a vertical restraint rack. The metal bands clamped tightly around his ankles, waist and throat. A medical droid entered the cell, plunging long hypodermic needles directly into the Padawan's arms. The droid pumped specialized neurotoxins into his bloodstream, causing his skeletal muscles to contract violently against the metal restraints. The intense physical pain spiked his heart rate, forcing him to clench his jaw as sweat rolled down his forehead. Admiral Karath activated the intercom system, his voice echoing from the small wall-mounted speakers. He demanded the exact coordinates of the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine and the current location of the hidden Republic fleet. The Padawan strained against the metal cuffs, pulling against the mechanical servos until the skin around his wrists bruised and split, refusing to utter a single word into the recording microphones. While the Padawan endured the interrogation protocols, Bastila utilized her own connection to the Force. She closed her eyes and projected a telepathic signal through the Durasteel bulkheads, reaching into the secondary cargo bay where the Sith troops had stored the captured astromech droid T-3M4. The droid rolled off the scanning table, extending its slicing appendage and physically overriding the internal electronic locks. T-3M4 navigated the ventilation shafts, bypassing the heavily patrolled corridors. The droid extended a small arc welder and melted the control panel outside the primary detention block. The heavy blast doors slid open. T-3M4 accessed the main security terminal, disabling the energy fields and releasing the heavy metal restraints holding the crew. The Padawan dropped from the restraint rack, landing heavily on the metal grating. He rubbed his raw wrists and retrieved his blue lightsaber from the nearby evidence locker. Bastila and Karth retrieved their own weapons, equipping their combat armor and checking their power cells. They fought their way out of the detention block, deflecting red plasma bolts and leaving deep scorch marks across the white corridor walls. They advanced toward the primary hangar bay, aiming to retake the Ebon Hawk. They rounded the final corner, stepping onto the metal walkway leading directly to the landing pad. Darth Malak stood perfectly still at the center of the walkway, completely blocking their path. He wore his heavy Durasteel armor and the mechanical servos of his cybernetic jaw whirred quietly in the stillness of the corridor. He ignited his lightsaber, holding the long, red plasma blade at his side. He did not initiate an attack. Instead, he looked directly at the Padawan, his metallic voice echoing against the bulkheads. He spoke clearly, outlining the specific events of the Jedi strike team boarding the flagship. He detailed how the Jedi Council had erased the memories of the captured Dark Lord, implanting the fabricated identity of a standard Republic soldier over the suppressed neural pathways. Malak pointed his metal finger straight at the Padawan's chest, stripping away the deception and directly addressing him as Darth Revan. The physical resonance of Malak's words triggered a violent reaction within the Padawan's cerebral cortex. The artificial neurological barriers constructed by the Jedi Masters shattered. A massive influx of suppressed memories flooded his conscious mind. He squeezed his eyes shut, grabbing the sides of his head with his hands. He saw vivid, detailed images of the Mandalorian mask buried in the grey ash of Cathar. He felt the intense, physical cold of the Starforge control console, draining the bioelectrical energy from his muscles. He saw the dark, empty eyes of the Sith Emperor on Dromund Kaas. The overwhelming sensory overload caused him to stagger backward, his boots sliding against the metal grating. He looked down at his own hands, recognizing the physical muscle memory that had guided his lightsaber strikes and his tactical decisions over the past several months. The fabricated identity dissolved completely, leaving Revan standing in the corridor, fully aware of his past actions as the supreme commander of the Sith Armada. Revan ignited his blue lightsaber, the plasma blade illuminating his face. He stepped forward, pushing the shock of the revelation aside, and engaged Malak in direct combat. The blue and red blades clashed violently, throwing showers of sparks across the corridor walls. Revan pivoted on the balls of his feet, utilizing the exact same spatial awareness and body mechanics he had perfected during his early training at the Jedi Temple. He deflected Malak's heavy, two-handed downward strikes, looking for an opening in the thick durasteel armor. Bastila recognized the physical superiority of the Sith Lord and the immediate danger to Revan. She activated her double-bladed lightsaber and sprinted between the two combatants. She locked her yellow blade against Malak's red plasma, pushing him backward and shouting for Revan and Carth to run to the Ebon Hawk. Revan hesitated, watching Bastila hold the narrow corridor alone. Carth grabbed Revan by the shoulder, physically pulling him away from the engagement and dragging him onto the loading ramp of the freighter, just as the heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing Bastila inside with the Dark Lord. Revan stood at the center of the Ebon Hawk's main cargo hold. He gripped the edges of a metal supply crate, his knuckles turning white as he stared down at the grating. The restored memories overlaid his current physical state. He processed the dual existence within his mind, the strict military discipline implanted by the Jedi Council and the ruthless strategic calculus he had forged as the Dark Lord of the Sith. He looked at Carth Onasi sitting in the pilot's chair, observing the Republic insignias on his flight suit. He then looked at the blue lightsaber hanging from his own utility belt. Revan possessed the full knowledge of his previous command over the Starforge, the location of the Rakatan devices, and the exact coordinates required to reach the unknown regions. He released his grip on the crate, his posture shifting from the rigid stance of a Republic soldier to the relaxed, fluid balance of a seasoned Force user. The freighter dropped out of hyperspace above the rocky, rust-colored surface of Korriban. Revan directed Carth to land the ship near the massive stone structures of the Sith Academy he had personally ordered constructed years prior. He walked down the landing ramp, his boots kicking up clouds of red dust. He wore the dark robes of a Sith acolyte, moving through the large stone arches of the academy entrance. The interior of the complex hummed with the sound of training sabers and the heavy footfalls of dark-armored guards. The instructors did not recognize the former Dark Lord beneath the plain apprentice robes. Revan infiltrated the lower levels of the academy, utilizing the shadows to bypass the main security checkpoints. He engaged the headmaster of the academy, a Zabrak named Uthar Wynn, in the deep catacombs of the Valley of the Dark Lords. Revan severed the headmaster's weapon with a fast horizontal strike and extracted the final set of navigational coordinates from the Academy's secure archives. He returned to the Ebon Hawk, compiling the complete star chart in the primary nav computer. Carth initiated the hyperdrive, following the newly completed route. The Ebon Hawk traveled through a dense, highly unstable star cluster filled with electromagnetic storms and rogue asteroids. The ship emerged from hyperspace in the direct shadow of the Star Forge. The massive automated factory hovered over the blue sun, surrounded by the entire Sith armada. Hundreds of Interdictor-class dreadnoughts and Centurion-class battlecruisers formed a thick, overlapping defensive grid. The heavy turbo-laser batteries tracked the small freighter as it approached. Suddenly, a massive Republic fleet dropped out of light speed directly behind the Ebon Hawk. Republic cruisers and gunships opened fire immediately, discharging concentrated volleys of proton torpedoes into the Sith lines. Master Vander Tokare commanded the Republic assault from the bridge of his flagship, having tracked the Ebon Hawk's transponder signal. The Ebon Hawk navigated the intense crossfire, dodging green and red plasma bolts. Carth piloted the freighter toward the equatorial trench of the Star Forge. He bypassed the automated defense turrets and landed the ship inside a designated hangar bay. Revan drew his blue lightsaber and walked down the ramp. He led his crew through the dark stone corridors of the massive station. The air temperature dropped significantly as they moved deeper into the facility. Automated blast doors opened, releasing waves of Sith assault droids and dark-armored stormtroopers. Revan cut through the metal chassis of the droids, his blue blade flashing brightly against the dark stone walls. HK-47 provided continuous heavy blaster fire, melting the armor plates of the defending Sith infantry. The strike team reached the main observation deck. Bastila Shan stood at the center of the room, wearing dark robes. Her yellow lightsaber hummed as she spun the double-bladed hilt in her hands. Darth Malak had tortured and turned her to the dark side during her captivity. She projected her battle meditation, directly empowering the Sith fleet outside the viewports. Revan stepped forward, lowering his weapon. He refused to strike her. He spoke clearly, reminding her of the bond they shared when she healed him on the bridge of the flagship. He appealed to her original dedication to the Jedi Order, projecting his own bioelectrical energy to counter the dark side corruption clouding her mind. The physical and mental resonance broke the Emperor's control. Bastila deactivated her weapon, dropping to her knees on the stone floor. She realigned her battle meditation, shifting the tactical advantage back to the Republic fleet, engaged in the orbital battle. Revan left Bastila on the observation deck and proceeded alone to the central command chamber. The massive room hummed with the sound of the siphoning conduits, drawing plasma from the star below. Darth Malak stood before the primary console, his red lightsaber ignited. He had connected several captive Jedi directly into the Star Forge machinery, suspended in cylindrical stasis tanks along the walls. He drew their life force into his own body to rapidly heal his physical injuries. Revan engaged him. The two former friends clashed violently, their plasma blades striking with enough force to crack the polished stone floor tiles. Revan moved constantly, preventing Malak from drawing heavy, stationary strikes. He systematically shattered the stasis tanks, severing Malak's external power source. Revan stepped inside Malak's guard, parrying a wide horizontal swing and driving his blue blade cleanly through the heavy durasteel armor of Malak's chest. The Dark Lord collapsed onto the grating, the red light fading from his cybernetic jaw as his biological functions ceased. Revan walked back to the Ebon Hawk, boarding the freighter as the Republic fleet concentrated their fire on the Star Forge's primary stabilizing fins. Karth piloted the ship out of the hangar bay just as the massive automated factory lost orbital stability. The enormous stone and metal structure plummeted directly into the blue sun, burning up instantly in the extreme heat of the corona. The surviving Sith ships scattered, jumping into hyperspace and retreating into the unknown regions. Revan returned to the Republic capital. He stood before the Jedi Council and the Senate, receiving the highest military honors for dismantling the Sith Empire he had originally created. The galaxy recognized him once again as the prodigal knight, the savior of the Republic, standing in the light side of the Force. However, the physical memories of the dark, ash-skinned emperor sitting on the obsidian throne of Dromund Kaas remained sharp and clear in his mind. The heavy durasteel doors of the Republic Senate rotunda slid open. Revan stepped into the massive chamber, wearing traditional brown Jedi robes instead of his military armor. The scorch marks and battle damage were gone, replaced by the clean, woven fabric of a peacekeeper. He walked down the central ramp, his boots clicking against the polished stone. Thousands of senators stood on their repulsor pods, cheering loudly and clapping their hands. Holographic cameras hovered in the air, recording his approach and broadcasting the ceremony across the holonet. Revan stood at the center of the rotunda, his head bowed slightly, as the Supreme Chancellor placed a heavy gold medallion around his neck. The physical weight of the metal pulled against his collarbone. He listened to the speeches praising his strategic brilliance and his ultimate rejection of the dark side. The entire galaxy celebrated his return to the light. Despite the public celebrations, Revan's restored memories isolated him from the Jedi Order. He spent his days in the quiet archives of the Coruscant Temple, surrounded by blue holographic records and stacked datapad drives. He did not engage in the daily sparring sessions or the communal meditations. Instead, he isolated himself at a corner terminal, pulling up navigational charts of the unknown regions and old supply manifests from the Mandalorian Wars. He traced the lines of the star maps, his eyes focused on the specific coordinates leading toward the hidden Sith Empire. He recalled the physical sensation of the dark energy freezing his muscles on Dromund Kaas. He knew the Sith Emperor had survived, holding a massive army in reserve, waiting for the Republic to weaken itself further. Bastila Shan visited him in the archives, pulling up a chair beside his terminal. She wore her beige Jedi tunic, her lightsaber clipped to her belt. They sat together in the dim light of the holoscreens. The shared physical link forged during the battle on the Sith flagship remained active, allowing them to sense each other's physiological states. Bastila observed the tension in Revan's jaw and the rapid, rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the metal desk. She recognized his growing restlessness and his singular focus on the external threat. Eventually, their shared experiences and constant proximity led to a formal union. They married in a quiet, private ceremony, deliberately defying the strict rules of the Jedi Council prohibiting emotional attachments. They purchased a small apartment in the upper levels of Coruscant, filling it with simple furniture and leaving the grand halls of the temple behind. However, the stability of their new life proved temporary. Revan's sleep cycles deteriorated. He woke up covered in cold sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs. The residual dark energy of the Sith Emperor still lingered in the suppressed corners of his neural pathways, triggering vivid, violent nightmares. He saw the grey, ash-skinned face of the Emperor and the red-skinned Sith warriors marching through the lightning storms of Dromund Kaas. The nightmares intensified, causing his hands to shake and his vision to blur during his waking hours. He realized the physical reprogramming performed by the Jedi Council had failed to completely erase the Emperor's influence. The hidden Sith faction remained an immediate, unaddressed physical threat to the entire galaxy. Revan packed a small canvas duffel bag with basic survival rations, a datapad containing the encrypted coordinates, and his blue lightsaber. He stood in the small living room of their Coruscant apartment, adjusting the strap of the bag over his shoulder. Bastila stood near the door, her hands resting on her stomach. She carried their unborn child, anchoring her physically to the core worlds. Revan explained his necessary departure. He stated he had to travel back into the unknown regions alone, locate the Sith Emperor, and eliminate the threat before the hidden armada could launch a surprise invasion. He pulled his brown hood over his head, concealing his features, and walked out the door. He boarded the Ebon Hawk, powering up the sublight engines and launching the freighter into the Coruscant traffic lanes. Canderous Ordo, the Mandalorian mercenary, and the rust-red assassin droid HK-47 stood waiting in the cockpit. Revan did not sit in the pilot's chair. Instead, he instructed Canderous to set a course for the outer rim, deliberately separating from his remaining crew. He handed Canderous the Mandalorian mask he had recovered from Cathar, the metal plate split down the middle by Malak's turbo laser blast. Revan ordered the mercenary to take the mask back to the scattered Mandalorian clans, use it as a symbol of authority, and rebuild their shattered society into a functional military force capable of defending the galaxy. He then walked down the loading ramp at a small refueling station on the edge of Republic space. The Ebon Hawk lifted off, leaving Revan standing alone on the permacrete pad. He purchased a small, unmarked starfighter, engaged the hyperdrive, and jumped back into the dark void of the unknown regions, entirely severing his physical ties to the known galaxy. Revan dropped out of hyperspace inside the boundaries of the unknown regions, piloting his small, unmarked starfighter through the dense, uncharted star clusters. He tracked the specific hyperroutes recorded on his datapad, navigating the treacherous asteroid fields and the violent electrical storms surrounding Dromund Kaas. He landed the fighter in the thick jungle outside the dark, sprawling metropolis. He abandoned the ship, walking through the heavy rain and mud toward the black obsidian walls of the central citadel. He wore his heavy brown Jedi robes, carrying his lightsaber clipped to his belt. He moved silently through the perimeter defenses, utilizing the dark weather and his knowledge of the Sith patrol routes to bypass the heavy infantry divisions guarding the courtyard. He entered the citadel, slipping past the armored guards and ascending the polished marble staircases. He navigated the dimly lit corridors, heading directly for the primary throne room. However, the Emperor expected his arrival. As Revan stepped through the heavy Durasteel blast doors, a squad of the Emperor's elite Imperial Guard stepped out of the shadows. These guards wore bright red armor plating and carried electro-staffs that crackled with purple energy. Revan ignited his blue lightsaber, the plasma blade illuminating the dark stone walls. He engaged the guards, deflecting their heavy strikes and severing their weapons. He pushed forward, driving the remaining guards back into the center of the throne room. The Sith Emperor sat on his jagged obsidian throne. He raised his pale gray hand, projecting a massive, concentrated wave of dark side energy directly at Revan. Revan braced his boots against the marble floor, raising his left hand to physically catch the incoming force wave. The raw bioelectrical energy slammed into him, pushing him backward across the stone tiles. He dug his heels into the floor, holding his position and pushing the energy back toward the throne. The physical strain caused the muscles in his arms to tremble. The Emperor intensified the output, dropping Revan to one knee. A red-skinned Sith Lord named Scourge stepped out from behind the throne. Scourge held the title of the Emperor's Wrath, serving as his personal executioner. He wore heavy black and crimson armor and carried a red lightsaber. Scourge watched the physical contest between Revan and the Emperor. He recognized Revan's strength and calculated the immediate tactical advantage. Scourge ignited his blade and charged the Emperor, swinging his weapon in a wide horizontal arc. The Emperor quickly redirected his dark energy, blasting Scourge backward into a stone pillar. The sudden release of pressure allowed Revan to stand up. He gripped his lightsaber with both hands, sprinting up the steps toward the throne. He swung his blue blade straight at the Emperor's chest. Before the plasma could connect, the Emperor raised his hands, projecting a web of thick, purple force lightning. The electrical current struck Revan directly in the chest, bypassing his heavy robes and surging into his nervous system. The intense voltage stopped his heart instantly. Revan collapsed onto the floor, his lightsaber deactivating as it rolled across the stone tiles. His breathing ceased, and his body lay completely motionless at the foot of the obsidian throne. The Emperor stepped down, looking at the fallen Jedi. He instructed the surviving Imperial guards to lift Revan's body and carry him down into the deepest, unmapped levels of the Citadel. The guards carried Revan into a massive, circular chamber constructed entirely of raw, unpolished stone. They strapped his inert body into a heavy durasteel restraint chair positioned in the exact center of the room. A medical droid injected a concentrated dose of synthetic adrenaline and specialized stims directly into Revan's neck, forcing his heart to restart and his lungs to draw breath. Revan opened his eyes, pulling against the thick metal cuffs, locking his wrists and ankles to the chair. The Emperor entered the chamber, walking slowly across the rough stone floor. He stood directly in front of Revan, placing his cold gray fingertips against Revan's temples. The Emperor pushed his consciousness straight into Revan's mind. He did not attempt to overwrite his neural pathways or erase his memories as the Jedi Council had done. Instead, the Emperor initiated a continuous, physical extraction of Revan's bioelectrical energy. He siphoned the raw force power directly from Revan's body, using the Jedi as a living battery to extend his own unnatural lifespan. The extraction process caused Revan's muscles to lock into rigid spasms. The veins along his arms and neck bulged against his skin, and his jaw clenched tightly. The Emperor maintained the physical connection, draining the energy at a slow, agonizing pace. Revan realized the Emperor intended to keep him alive indefinitely within the stasis chamber. He focused his remaining strength, building a solid mental barrier to protect the specific coordinates of the Republic core worlds and the location of Bastila and his unborn child. He pushed back against the Emperor's invasive presence, engaging in a silent, static war of attrition. The physical environment of the stone chamber faded from his vision, replaced by the endless gray expanse of the Emperor's consciousness. Revan locked his mind into a permanent defensive posture, dedicating every ounce of his remaining stamina to holding the mental barricade intact. The heavy durasteel blast doors of the chamber slammed shut, sealing Revan inside the dark catacombs of Dromund Kaas, beginning an imprisonment that would stretch across the next 300 years. 300 years later, around the year 3642, before the Battle of Yavin, the Sith Empire finally launched its invasion. The Emperor had spent centuries building a massive, highly organized military force within the unknown regions. Sith dreadnoughts, featuring the same dark, angular hull designs Revan had seen during his initial scouting mission, crossed the border into Republic space. These fleets immediately targeted the primary Outer Rim defense installations, deploying thousands of red-armored Imperial troops onto the surface of key agricultural and industrial worlds. A brutal, grinding conflict known as the Great Galactic War erupted, pitting the rigid military hierarchy of the Sith Empire against the massive, scattered fleets of the Galactic Republic. During the initial years of the conflict, a Jedi Knight known as the Hero of Tython uncovered detailed historical records hidden within the archives of the Coruscant Temple. The records contained fragmentary data regarding Revan's final mission to the unknown regions, including encrypted astrogation charts tracking his flight path toward Dromund Kaas. The Jedi Knight boarded a Defender-class light corvette and followed the coordinates, navigating the asteroid fields and electrical storms surrounding the Sith capital. He infiltrated the deep subterranean levels of the Emperor's obsidian citadel, cutting through squads of red-armored Imperial guards with his lightsaber. He reached the heavy durasteel blast doors of the containment facility and severed the locking mechanisms, stepping into the massive circular stone chamber. Revan remained strapped into the heavy durasteel restraint chair in the center of the room. The thick metal cuffs locked his wrists and ankles tightly against the metal frame. His physical body had not aged over the past 300 years, preserved perfectly by the continuous, agonizing flow of the Emperor's bioelectrical extraction. He wore the same brown Jedi robes he had donned when leaving Coruscant, though the fabric was now covered in dust and dried blood. The Jedi Knight activated the control console, disabling the heavy restraints. Revan slumped forward, his boots hitting the rough stone floor. He placed his hands flat against the cold tiles, pushing his upper body up. His muscles cramped violently, and his joints popped loudly as he forced his rigid limbs to move for the first time in centuries. He grabbed his original blue lightsaber from a nearby evidence locker, hooking the familiar metal cylinder onto his utility belt. Revan walked out of the citadel and boarded the Jedi Knight's corvette. He traveled directly to a hidden Republic deep space staging point known as the Foundry. The station consisted of a massive ring structure orbiting a bright yellow dwarf star, originally constructed by the Rakata species. The Republic military had retrofitted the station, installing modern sensor arrays and heavy deflector shields. Revan took command of the facility. He stood on the central command deck, wearing his traditional brown robes over a set of heavy plastoid chest armor. He reviewed the tactical data on the holotable, analyzing the current battle lines of the Great Galactic War. He noticed the Sith Emperor utilizing specialized dark-armored execution squads composed entirely of Sith purebloods. Revan remembered the physiological structure of these red-skinned aliens from his initial infiltration of Dromund Kaas. He formulated a strategy to cripple the Empire's command structure. Revan ordered the automated manufacturing units of the Foundry to begin mass-producing thousands of specialized extermination droids. He programmed the targeting sensors of these droids to lock on to the specific genetic markers of the Sith pureblood species. The automated assembly lines activated, stamping out the metallic chassis and heavy blaster rifles of the droids at a rapid pace. Revan planned to deploy this specialized droid army across the galaxy, entirely bypassing the human and alien recruits of the Imperial military and systematically executing anyone carrying the original Sith genetic code. He calculated this targeted genocide would decapitate the Emperor's leadership ranks, causing the entire Imperial military apparatus to collapse inward. The Sith Empire intercepted the physical shipments of raw materials heading to the foundry and pinpointed its location. A specialized Imperial strike team, composed of high-ranking Sith lords and heavily armed bounty hunters, boarded a stealth transport and bypassed the Republic defense perimeter. The team breached the main airlocks of the foundry, cutting through the outer blast doors and engaging the newly constructed extermination droids in the central corridors. The Imperial team pushed past the automated defenses, clearing the hangar bays and advancing toward the primary command deck. Revan stood at the center of the command deck. He ignited his blue lightsaber, the plasma blade humming loudly in the enclosed space. He simultaneously raised his left hand, channeling the residual dark energy he had absorbed during his imprisonment. A thick stream of purple force lightning erupted from his fingertips, striking the incoming Imperial troops. He wielded both the light and the dark sides of the force simultaneously, reflecting his fractured internal state. He swung his blue blade in rapid horizontal arcs, parrying the incoming strikes of the Sith Lords while blasting the bounty hunters backward with concussive shockwaves of dark energy. The intense physical combat strained his recently liberated muscles. The Sith strike team overwhelmed his defenses, driving heavy plasma blasts directly into his chest armor. Revan collapsed onto the metal grating. A brilliant flash of white light consumed his physical form, leaving only his scorched brown robes and his deactivated lightsaber resting on the polished floor tiles of the command deck. 300 years passed. The physical location of the foundry remained hidden, operating silently in the deep space of the unknown regions. Revan did not die on the command deck. The flash of white light transported him into the primary stasis network of the station, locking his biological functions into a state of suspended animation, similar to his imprisonment on Dromund Kaas. He hovered inside a cylindrical containment pod filled with translucent, preserving fluid. Heavy durasteel tubes connected the pod to the station's main reactor, sustaining his physical body while suppressing his conscious mind. He hung motionless in the liquid, surrounded by the automated assembly lines and the dormant ranks of the extermination droids he had ordered constructed centuries prior. Around the year 3640 BBY, the ongoing war between the Galactic Republic and the Sith Empire reached a critical phase. Republic and Imperial fleets scoured the unknown sectors of space, deploying deep space probes to locate hidden tactical assets. An Imperial recon vessel picked up the faint energy signature of the Foundry. A specialized strike team of dark-armored Sith Lords and heavily armed Imperial commandos boarded a transport shuttle and navigated the dense asteroid field surrounding the yellow dwarf star. They breached the outer airlocks of the station, using concentrated thermal charges to blow the heavy blast doors off their tracks. The Imperial team cleared the dark corridors, engaging the automated security turrets and making their way toward the primary containment sector. The Sith commanders reached the central control room and located the primary stasis pod. They bypassed the security mainframes, slicing the control terminal and initiating the rapid decompression sequence. The thick preserving fluid drained from the cylindrical tank, spilling over the metal floor grating. The heavy glass doors of the pod slid open. Revan slumped forward, dropping to his hands and knees on the cold durasteel floor. He gasped for air, his lungs expanding violently after centuries of forced dormancy. His brown Jedi robes hung loosely over his frame, soaked with the chemical residue of the stasis fluid. The Sith strike team surrounded him, igniting their red lightsabers and aiming their heavy repeating blasters directly at his head. Revan looked at the red-armored Imperial troops and the Sith purebloods standing before him. The physical sight triggered the suppressed memories of his time on Dromund Kaas and the continuous, agonizing extraction of his bioelectrical energy by the Sith Emperor. The residual dark energy remaining in his neural pathways flared. He did not reach for the blue lightsaber clipped to his belt. Instead, he raised both hands and projected a massive shockwave of pure telekinetic force. The physical impact threw the heavy Imperial commandos backward across the room, smashing their armored bodies into the control consoles and shattering the glass steel viewports. Revan stood up, the water dripping from his robes. He extended his fingers, summoning thick torrents of purple force lightning that arced across the chamber and struck the Sith Lords. He maintained the electrical barrage, dropping the remaining invaders to the floor. Revan walked out of the containment sector, his boots leaving wet footprints across the metal grating. He bypassed the main hangar bays and accessed a small secondary escape pod bay located on the outer ring of the station. He activated the launch sequence of a single pod, strapping himself into the crash seat as the explosive bolts fired. The pod ejected from the foundry, shooting past the orbiting Imperial stealth transport and disappearing into the dense asteroid field. He left the ancient Rakatan station behind, securing his physical freedom but carrying the intense psychological fracture caused by his dual experiences. The escape pod drifted through the outer edges of the galaxy until a passing smuggling freighter picked up the distress beacon. Revan boarded the freighter, keeping his hood pulled low over his face. He traveled through the outer rim transit hubs, acquiring a dark, rigid set of combat armor and a heavy metal mask similar to his original Mandalorian faceplate. He painted the new armor black and gray, hiding the brown Jedi robes beneath the heavy plating. He completely abandoned the traditional philosophies of the Jedi Order and the rigid hierarchies of the Sith Empire. He operated entirely on his own, focusing his fractured mind on a single, overriding objective: the absolute and final destruction of the Sith Emperor. He traveled to the hidden moon of Yavin 4, locating an ancient stone temple complex buried deep within the thick, humid jungle. He established the temple as his base of operations, assembling a radical faction of followers drawn from the fringes of both the Republic and the Empire. This group, known as the Order of Revan, consisted of disillusioned Jedi Knights, former Sith acolytes, and heavily armed mercenaries. They wore dark grey robes and modified combat armor, completely rejecting their former allegiances. Revan stood before them in the main courtyard of the temple, his new metal mask locked in place. He raised his voice, echoing through the heavy stone walls. He announced his plan to utilize a massive dark side ritual, intending to forcefully resurrect the physical body of the Sith Emperor solely for the purpose of permanently destroying him. The Order of Revan raised their weapons, preparing to execute the final stage of their commander's solitary war. Revan stood at the apex of the great stone temple on Yavin 4. He raised his arms, projecting a massive cylinder of crackling purple dark side energy high into the humid atmosphere. The followers of the Order of Revan knelt on the stone steps below, chanting in unison and channeling their own bioelectrical energy upward into the central pillar. The physical intensity of the ritual caused the surrounding jungle to wither. The broad green leaves turned brown and crumbled to dust, and the local wildlife fled from the immediate perimeter. The heavy durasteel armor on Revan's chest vibrated with the raw kinetic output. The combined energy tore at the physical boundaries of the Force, acting as a massive biological beacon designed to pull the Emperor's disembodied consciousness out of the deep unknown regions and bind it to a physical vessel located within the temple courtyard. Republic and Imperial strike teams breached the temple perimeters simultaneously. The two opposing military factions, recognizing the immediate danger of resurrecting the Sith Emperor, agreed to a temporary ceasefire. Republic Havoc Squad commandos advanced alongside dark-armored Imperial shock troopers. They cut through the thick vines covering the temple walls with plasma torches and engaged the Order of Revan in close-quarters combat. Heavy blaster bolts struck the stone pillars, sending shards of rock flying across the courtyards. The combined strike teams pushed their way up the main staircase, stepping over the fallen bodies of the cultists. They reached the apex of the temple, disrupting the energy flow of the chanting acolytes and surrounding Revan. The physical interruption caused the central pillar of purple energy to flicker and destabilize, discharging erratically into the stone floor. Revan ignited two lightsabers, one projecting a standard blue blade and the other a synthetic red blade. He engaged the combined strike force directly. He parried a heavy downward strike from an Imperial Sith Lord with his red blade while simultaneously driving the blue plasma through the chest plate of a Republic commando. He moved with the same fluid, precise mechanics he had utilized during the Mandalorian Wars, compensating for the physical degradation caused by centuries of imprisonment. He pushed forward, launching concussive telekinetic blasts that threw the heavy infantry troopers back down the stone steps. The strike team adjusted their tactics, forming a tight defensive ring and firing concentrated volleys of heavy laser fire directly at Revan's center mass. The sustained blaster fire overwhelmed Revan's physical guard. Multiple plasma bolts struck his dark chest armor, melting the durasteel and searing the flesh underneath. He dropped his lightsabers, the metal hilts clattering against the stone floor. Revan fell to his knees, his breathing ragged and shallow. The physical damage to his body was terminal. The remaining members of the strike team kept their weapons trained on him, slowly closing the circle. Revan looked up at the soldiers, the cracked metal of his mask reflecting the red and blue glow of the deactivated lightsabers. He reached up with his trembling hands and unsealed the atmospheric locks. He pulled the mask from his face and dropped it onto the stone tiles. The physical action signified the complete and final end of his long military campaign against the Emperor, the Republic, and the galaxy itself. As Revan's physical body expired on the temple steps, the destabilized purple energy pillar above them violently expanded. A massive shockwave of pure dark side force exploded outward, knocking the entire strike team flat against the stone floor. The Emperor's consciousness, drawn across the galaxy by the ritual, manifested as a dark, swirling cloud of electrical static above the courtyard. The Emperor did not bind to the physical vessel. Instead, the disembodied entity consumed the raw bioelectrical energy released by the dying cultists and the fallen soldiers. The dark cloud rapidly accelerated upward, breaking through the atmosphere of Yavin 4 and disappearing into the deep space of the galaxy. Revan had intended to trap and destroy the Emperor, but his ritual had inadvertently provided the ancient Sith with the exact energy required to break his physical tether and roam the galaxy unchecked. Revan's body lay motionless on the stone tiles. The surviving Republic and Imperial soldiers stood up, brushing the dust from their armor. They looked at the empty sky and the broken Mandalorian mask resting next to the fallen commander. They secured their weapons and walked back down the long stone staircase, leaving the body behind. The temporary alliance immediately dissolved. The two factions returned to their respective fleets in orbit, re-engaging their turbo-laser batteries and continuing the Great Galactic War. Revan's final actions had fundamentally altered the physical landscape of the conflict, setting the stage for a much larger and more destructive confrontation with the disembodied Sith Emperor. His long, violent journey spanning centuries of warfare, memory wipes, and imprisonment finally concluded on the ruined steps of the Yavin Temple. The heavy boots of the Republic and Imperial strike teams crunched against the loose gravel as the soldiers marched back down the grand stone staircase of the Yavin 4 Temple. At the apex of the structure, Revan's dark-armored body rested on the cracked permacrete tiles. The heavy plasma burns across his durasteel chestplate smoked in the humid air, emitting the distinct smell of melted wiring and scorched flesh. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements, scraping the metal armor against the stone floor. The ambient temperature around the center of the courtyard dropped sharply. A bright blue light coalesced in the air directly above the fallen commander. The light condensed into the distinct, translucent shape of a human figure. This blue projection wore the woven cotton tunics and leather braces of a traditional Jedi Knight. The facial features matched Revan's physical appearance from his early years at the Coruscant Temple, showing smooth skin and clear eyes. The projection hovered inches above the stone floor, allowing the ambient sunlight to pass entirely through its form and illuminate the tiles below. A dead leaf drifted down from the jungle canopy and passed completely through the blue shoulder of the apparition. The physical body on the floor turned its head, looking up at the glowing figure. The dark side corruption remained visible in the physical form, displaying sallow skin and bright yellow irises. The two separate physical manifestations of the exact same biological entity occupied the identical space. The blue projection stepped forward and extended a glowing hand downward. The armored body reached upward, lifting a heavy durasteel gauntlet into the air. The mechanical servos in the armor whined and sparked from the battle damage. The metal fingers clasped the translucent blue hand. A brilliant column of white plasma erupted from the point of contact, accompanied by a loud, concussive crack of static discharge. The intense white light expanded rapidly, completely engulfing both the dark-armored body and the blue projection. The resulting shockwave blew the surrounding dust and loose rocks out of the courtyard and into the dense jungle brush. The bright plasma column flared for 3 seconds before fading completely. The smoke cleared from the apex of the temple. A hollow set of black durasteel armor lay collapsed on the stone tiles. The chest plate rested flat against the backplate, and the metal gauntlets sat empty on the ground. The interior of the suit contained only ambient air. The cracked Mandalorian mask sat beside the armor, its dark, T-shaped visor reflecting the green sunlight filtering through the canopy. The biological functions of the Supreme Commander ceased in that exact location, leaving only his manufactured equipment behind on the ruined stones. In the decades following the battle on Yavin 4, the physical evidence of his campaigns circulated through the central archives of both warring factions. Inside the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, young Padawans sat at glowing blue holoterminals. They scrolled through the digital text of Revan's crossfire strategies and his orbital bombardment coordinates. They stood in the training rings, stepping through the precise, geometric footwork he had utilized during the Mandalorian Wars. Across the galaxy on the red sands of Korriban, Sith acolytes accessed deep subterranean data vaults. They pressed their fingers against carved stone obelisks, detailing Revan's aggressive lightsaber parries and his bioelectrical dark side channeling techniques. Both the Republic military commanders and the Sith Imperial generals printed his tactical manuals onto flimsiplast sheets and distributed them to their infantry sergeants. Deep within the lower, industrial levels of Dromund Kaas, secretive gatherings of soldiers and citizens congregated inside solid-walled basement rooms. They forged heavy iron masks on hot anvils, hammering the metal to replicate the exact dimensions of the Cathar relic. They bolted these replica faceplates over their heads and wrapped their shoulders in dark grey cloaks. They traded small, encrypted data chips containing Revan's raw, original holocron recordings. They ignited dual lightsabers, activating one red plasma blade and one blue plasma blade, mirroring the exact weapons he had wielded on the temple steps. They constructed small stone shrines, placing their dual sabers across the altars to signify their adherence to his specific combat doctrines. His genetic sequence persisted in the biological makeup of his descendants. A woman named Satele Shan carried his exact DNA profile. She sat in the center of the Jedi High Council chamber, wearing a blue tunic and heavy leather boots. She ignited a blue double-bladed lightsaber, mimicking the weapon style of her ancestor Bastila. Satiel stood on the command decks of Republic dreadnoughts, pointing her fingers at the glowing tactical maps and directing the fleet along the precise hyperspace routes Revan had charted centuries prior. The Republic ships followed the blue holographic lines into the unknown regions, continuing the massive territorial conflict using his exact navigational data. The original Mandalorian mask sat inside a heavily shielded vault in the Coruscant Temple archives. The deep blast scorches from Cassius Fett's basilisk war droids and the melted edges from Darth Malak's turbo laser barrage marked the metal surface. The heavy iron plate rested on a small durasteel pedestal, locked behind a thick glass steel barrier. The internal pressure seals and the electronic vocabulator remained completely silent in the temperature-controlled room. People leave physical tracks on the ground they walk. A heavy boot leaves a deep impression in the wet mud, and the resulting ridge holds water long after the rain stops falling. Other travelers step into those identical depressions, aligning their feet with the exact route carved by the first person. Some walk exclusively on the brightly illuminated permacrete of the city streets, and others step entirely through the thick, wet moss of the lower swamps. A few individuals carry the white dust of the capital worlds and the red sand of the outer rim on the same pair of boots. I hope you found rest near the heat of this fire. You can close your eyes now and listen to the crackle of the burning wood. Return to this hearth whenever your legs grow tired. Sleep well,